Good morning and welcome to day 3 of our Heritage Month webinar 2024. For those of you who have joined us from Monday, we want to thank you for your continued participation. It has been a very exciting program, which we continue today under the theme of digital cultural heritage. So today's program will focus on the exciting realm of digital cultural heritage, and we will be exploring how digital technologies are transforming the conservation and interpretation of our heritage resources. We'll also be looking at how this transformation in the digital space can lead to greater accessibility of our heritage resources. Our speakers today will be showcasing innovative projects with digital archives and virtual experiences that are making heritage more interactive and inclusive. So we have a very exciting program for you. For some of us who are millennials, we are still stuck in the third industrial revolution. So today's experience will be talking about how the fourth and the fifth IR are transforming heritage management, not just in South Africa, but globally. So before we begin, we have our introduction from our CEO, Advocate Lungisa Malkas, and then we'll have a welcome and purpose for today from our Executive Officer for Heritage Resources Management, Ms. Mamakomoreng Nkasi Lisowona. Over to the CEO for the introduction and welcome.
Very good morning to everybody. Good morning, distinguished guests, colleagues, valued partners, and the heritage community of South Africa. It is my great privilege to welcome you to SARA's 2024 Heritage Month webinar. This year's celebrations hold special significance as it coincides with the 30th anniversary of our democracy. 30 years ago, South Africa embarked on a transformative journey, and today we gather not only to celebrate our democracy, but also to reflect on how far we've come in preserving and protecting the rich heritage that defines us as a nation. Heritage is the heartbeat of our identity, and it is fitting that as we mark this milestone, we also pause to reflect on the progress we've made in safeguarding our cultural and historical legacies. Over the next 4 days, we will engage in thought-provoking discussions, hear from experts in the field, and explore new ways to ensure that our heritage continues to inspire and unite us as we look ahead to the future. Today, on day 1, we begin with reflections on 30 years of heritage management in South Africa. Over the past 3 decades, we have witnessed remarkable achievements in the preservation of our heritage sites, traditions, and cultural practices. We've also faced challenges, but these have only strengthened our resolve. Our speakers will provide a comprehensive look back, offering insights into the journey we've undertaken to protect and to promote the heritage of all South Africans. Tomorrow on day 2, we shift our focus towards the next 30 years of heritage management. As we look ahead, we must ask ourselves, how do we build on the foundation of the past to ensure that our heritage is preserved for the future, for future generations? This session will be forward-thinking, exploring innovative strategies and emerging trends in the field of heritage management. It will be an opportunity for us to dream big and plan for a future where heritage is not only safeguarding, but also actively integrated into the lives of all South Africans. On day 3, we enter the exciting world of digital cultural heritage. Technology has opened new doors for us, making heritage more accessible than ever before. We will explore the ways in which digital tools are revolutionizing how we interact with and preserve our heritage. from virtual tours of heritage sites to digital archives that can be accessed from anywhere in the world. This session will showcase how we are harnessing technology to ensure that our heritage reaches a global audience. Finally, on day 4, we culminated this incredible week with the launch of SARIS 2.0. This is a pivotal moment for us at SARA. The revamped South African Heritage Resources Information System is not only a technological upgrade, it represents a new era in how we manage access and protect our heritage. SARIS 2.0 will be an invaluable tool for researchers, educators, and the general public. It will be available both in person and virtually, ensuring that everyone, no matter where they are, can connect with our heritage resources. This launch symbolizes our commitment to evolving with the times and using the best of modern technology to serve the needs of heritage management in South Africa. As we look to the next 30 years of democracy and heritage management, I am filled with optimism. We have come so far, and yet there is so much more we can achieve as to build a better future. Together, we can ensure that the richness of our culture, history, and traditions continues to thrive, enriching the lives of future generations. Thank you for joining us in this journey. Let us embrace the next 4 days with curiosity, reflection, and a shared vision for the future. May the next 30 years of democracy and heritage be even more remarkable than the last. I thank you.
Thank you so much for those wonderful words, CEO. I would now like to hand over to the executive for Heritage Resources Management at SARA, Ms. Mamakamoreng Nkasi Lisona. Over to you, Komi.
Thank you, Van, and good morning, colleagues. Good morning to our guests, and good morning to our esteemed panel this morning to help us to go through the topics and application of digital cultural heritage. As we go through day 3, over the 2 days, you engaged as within the seminars through the 30 years, the next 30 years. And in that, our panelists took you through some developments and research that is going on within the sector. As we embark on digital cultural heritage, I think it is a challenge for us as the cultural heritage sector in terms of how we apply the digital technologies. I do think that in South Africa, a country as diverse as ours, and with as much diversity of our cultural heritage, of course, this should be an asset that should benefit the people who own these cultural resources. So one would ask then, what's stopping South Africans from leveraging their own cultural heritage? And maybe the answer lies in the innovation in digital technologies. I do think we are still very much limited and far behind compared to other countries, especially the Asian countries that have taken leaps in using AIs and the fourth industrial revolution. However, this one is, I think, a challenge to us as the sector in terms of how we can make the cultural resources more accessible, more interactive, more engaging, especially for our younger populations. Conservation does not imply preservation without change. And so as we embrace the digital technologies, you will see through the presentations from our panelists this morning that there's a way we can be inclusive. It is just a matter of how do we really invest in these technologies. And I would like to challenge our engagements today and with the question of how can we include digital innovation in our conservation. It is not enough for us to say our resources are kept for future generations. It is also important for us to answer the question of how they are consumed. And so with that, I would like to wish you fruitful deliberations this morning. Thank you very much for making your time to be with us. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Komi. I think in terms of the engagements we've had for the last 2 days, the audience response is challenge accepted. Digital cultural heritage is quite important and pivotal, again, talking about future generations and how they're going to consume these resources that we're conserving for them. It is important that we have this discussion today. So in terms of our program, we have 3 speakers for you today. Our last speaker, Mr. Goching Lang, is unfortunately unavailable. However, Dr. Roger Layton, Dr. Sadiq Mutala, and Mr. Isak Potgieter are present today and are very exciting talks for all of you. Just a little bit of house rules. You are welcome to use the chat at any point to ask a question or post a comment. At the end of each talk, I'll also give you an opportunity to raise your hand to engage with the speakers. But most importantly, please keep your microphones muted so that you do not interrupt with the speakers during their talks. And with that said, let us get to our first talk for today from Dr. Roger Layton. Now, Dr. Roger Layton started in the ICT sector in the 1970s, and he's now approaching the end of his 55th year of continuous work. He lectured in computer science and business information systems at Wits University from 1981 to 1994, and then started his company, Roger Layton Associates, RLA, which he still runs with support from other directors and staff. He continues to work in database management, development, and application development, and is continuously learning how to apply new technologies. In 2005, his focus shifted to the heritage sector and addressing the challenges of how to maintain data over the long term, essentially the internal time frame, and he conceived the notion of eternal heritage and spun off a business unit called Ether, which is an acronym for Eternal Heritage. And it remains a focal point of his work, which has grown from strength to strength over the years and which has broadened into many areas of museum and heritage management. He conducts training in many areas of museum practice, including digitization and collection management, and uses his experience with museums to improve these courses. Within the company, he has worked extensively on a number of pivotal legislations and guidelines, and these include the draft national policy on digitization, the costing of the national policy on digitization, the digitization of the newsreel collections at the National Film and Video Sound Archives, the national terminology policy, the bills to revise the Archives Act, the Legal Deposit Act, and also broadening practices for the recording and application of indigenous building practices for public works. He has also developed the national policy on digitization, guidelines on the implementation of the NARA built environment for DPW, and also the guidelines on the inclusion of IKS into DPW buildings. So his resume, I think, is as long as his work experience, and we've kept him quite busy. He's just coming from the summer conference as well, but we decided to hijack him for this one. And with those words, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Roger Layton.
Well, firstly, I just want to double check you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, very. Actually, as I've mentioned, I had taken a leave this week and I'm up in the mountains. The internet connection is not very good. So welcome everybody, and I'm going to apologize in advance for any of you who attended our keynote presentation at the SAM conference last week, because I'm essentially giving the same talk again. When I look at the names that I can see here, there are a few people who were there. So I'm just, for you, I'm going to apologize in advance because this is largely based upon this, and I first time I can ever doing the same presentation twice. I have adapted it a bit, and I'm going to give a bit of a history. So let me first open up this, and now I've got to see if I can switch on here. I'm going to share. I'm also going to put on the sound. I'm hopefully going to show a couple of the videos that we've digitized, actually not videos, the 35mm newsreels that we've digitized, just to provide a bit of contextual reference to where the it's almost the visual history and the visual movement history fits into the rest of the work, because it's certainly, in my opinion, this has been a very neglected space in digitization, is that of films, videos, and even sound as well, and certainly only coming to the fore way after the digitization of museum objects and others. So we found our way into the space, and now we are about to and I'm trying to find out why this is not. Oh, there we go. I have to press one more button, and there we are. Good. Now, let me tell you a little bit about where I am right now. Now, can you hear?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, good. Okay, because there was a bit of echo
Of where I am now. This is the view from my window. And this is an older picture, but effectively looks the same. So here I am looking up at the Champagne mountain range with my garden in front there, and it's quite nice up here. This happens to be my training center, and I've taken the week off to do renovations, serious renovations, and that's why there might be a bit of noise of trees falling down and other things in the background, but this is just part of what I'm doing. So the talk that I gave at SAMA, I called The Long Future of Museums. So I didn't use the word digital, but certainly it is assumed that this is a digital future, but it might go beyond a digital future to things we don't yet understand. So my goal is to present this not only for today, or even tomorrow, but to 200 years into the future. Now, the big advantage of presenting things to 200 years of the future is that nobody is there to be able to say whether I was right or wrong.
when we did our
Sorry, Dr. Layton.
policy on digitization in 2009.
Doc-
Yes,
Your presentation is not showing.
can you hear me?
Yes, your presentation is not showing.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to try again. Okay. Let me know if you can see that one.
Still not showing.
It's the bandwidth that is limiting this, because we've got two internet providers up here. One of them is Vodacom from my phone currently using, and the one is our normal internet connection, which went down this morning in the entire day. So I'm working off the Vodacom phone system. Okay, now I'm going to try once more do sharing. If you just hold on one moment, I'm just going to double check the speed of the line. It's a bit of a pity because I've got some quite nice pictures coming up here that I wanted to show you. Generally, connectivity up here is pretty good.
Now, what I think I'm going to have to do, actually, one of our other areas of work beyond museums is we work with persons with disabilities. So I'm perhaps going to have to give this as though you're all a blind audience, which we have given before.
All right. You're welcome to proceed.
Where to paint the pictures in words that I do. Using good night.
No, it's still not showing it.
I'm going to try once more.
All right.
Let me try again. I don't know if there are any limitations on the presentation.
You can try put it on presenter mode.
Don't allow me. I don't have access to presenter mode here. I've only got one screen in front of me. Normally presenter mode only works if you've got two screens. Okay, I'm just going to talk then.
Yeah, please proceed.
Looking at in front of me is my front. This forest that I have planted there, which I planted 30 years ago. And in the background, you'll see the Catherine Peak and the Champagne Castle Mountains with the Dragon's Back, which is where the Drakensberg gets its name from. Now, this is a property that I've owned for 30 years now, and it is the place where I also run my workshops, because I've converted the old stables there into a small conference and training center. It also runs as a guest house. Now, that is entirely incidental. I'm just putting the context of where I am right now to actually make you all feel a little jealous right now. I know those down in Cape Town have also got a nice little mountain as well, but this is a real mountain that we've got here. This is 3,500 meters high, and it's the biggest, the tallest in the country. So I recently presented this paper, or a variation of it, because I've made a few variations, last Tuesday as the keynote address at the SAMA conference, South African Museums Association conference. And I spoke about the theme of the conference was the digital revolution, South African museums revolution. And the talk that I gave was the long future of museums, in essence, to see how far can we push our planning horizon in terms of museums, on the understanding that museums have been around for about maybe 200 years in a formal sense. And can we project that 200 years into the future and say, what is our generation's responsibility in this? Now, when we start working in this sector, we are in a very special place, because we are in the place of looking after things forever. And virtually nobody else in the world has got that responsibility. And that is why our responsibility is not just doing a job and then going home at the end and retiring. It is a custodial responsibility that needs us to then be there and to continue afterwards and to hand over. And if I can say, one of the greatest faults in the entire sector, the heritage sector, the museums, even the reference libraries, is the lack of the handover from one custodian to another. Where we find new custodians come in, they want to reinvent the wheel, they are like the new broom, and they lose the intellectual and the institutional memory that comes with this. So, your seminar today's one is the digital cultural heritage, and I want to talk around that. So I'm going to talk about my journey and my team. How did I get here? And it's very, very relevant that this is the SARA conference, and I'm going to talk about that. I also want to talk about the role we're playing to improve the future. I want to put some of those projects that were mentioned in terms of my CV on what those are and how those fit into modeling the future to make it better. I then want to take a little background and have a look at the conference from last week, the SAMA conference, unpack some of the papers that were there and look at the evidence that we saw of emerging digital culture coming through. Then I want to position it a little bit to the future, talk about some of the models that I have built. And I have mentioned over the years that one of my strengths is as a model builder, being able to find a way to develop frameworks to put in a complexity and put it into a simplified model. And I leave behind a lot of models that I'm leaving as a legacy for the others in my company who are going to continue after me, but also as a hopefully a legacy for the sector as a whole. And I want to talk about one of these in particular. I then want to talk about the three futures I'm looking at, which I call the near future, which is immediate, the short future, which might still be within my lifetime, but possibly not, and then the long future beyond all of our lifetimes into the next generation that we have to hand on to. So let's have a look at what the SAMA conference theme was. It was called Digital Revolution, South African Museums, and the, yeah, I've just had one of my staff ask me if they can present this for me, but the only problem, and it was a mistake I made, this conference, this paper that I'm presenting here, this presentation is about 1.5 gigabytes in size. And therefore, I don't think that that is a feasible thing. And it's going to be a bit of a problem. I'll tell you what, they might be able to show the videos. So I'll see if we can just get the video shown here. Okay. So I'm going to talk about my journey and how did I get here. And what I'm going to do is stop at this point and try to share again. And let me just...
Thanks, Dr. Layton.
It's unusual it doesn't work because clearly we do this every day. Yes.
Please proceed. No problem. There we go. It's now showing. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. So firstly, how did I get here? And I'm not talking about how did I get here, driving down from Johannesburg to the KZN. It wasn't that. My journey in this area. Now, I'm going to present something now, which is a bit of a history lesson. And it goes back to the very first paper I ever, which was in 2006. And it was based upon the work we had done on the SARS system. And we had started our work at SARA in 2005, and by June 2006, we were already well on the way to developing a lot of the models of it. Now, of course, this particular model never became the SARS as you see it today that is going to be presented tomorrow by Jake. And I had a lot of good interactions with Jake at the SAMA conference and listened to his paper and see the direction it's taking there. But this is where we were in 2006. Now, I could probably trace back the work that I was doing to around about that date, which is, we're talking 18 years ago. Now, that means 18 years I've been involved in this sector, and I want to talk about why am I still here in this sector. And I can tell you from a business point of view, it's not a high-paying sector to be in, but it really gives great job satisfaction and it allows us to leave a legacy for the future. Now, 18 years, just to put you in the picture, is 25% of my life I've spent in this time. Now, the mathematicians there will figure out then, how old I am right now. I'm far too old to still be around here, but I'm enjoying what I'm doing. So this particular paper was on the codification of the intangible heritage. Now, what we found at the time that we were looking at SARS was pretty good models that were available for the tangible heritage, but very little that was there to enable the intangible heritage to be documented. And so this paper went around that. And just to give you an example of the picture there, I had recently come back from Peru. This was taken up in a place called Puno on Lake Titicaca. These islands here are floating islands. They've been there for 800 years.
Dr. Layton? Sorry, the image is not moving.
Yeah.
The image is not moving. We're still on the first page. We're still seeing my journey.
I'm still on the same slide.
Okay, sorry, apologies. Please proceed.
Okay. Yeah, so here you'll see a little natural museum, and I thought I must take a picture of this because for me, this was the most amazing thing. In the middle of this very poor community that live on reeds, they had developed a little museum of their natural history sitting on top of these reeds here. And that really touched me quite a lot. Now, I hadn't started the project. This was 2004. And I just thought, well, that is very interesting. And I wanted to try and position, why do I find, and here was some of my things, how do we store intangible heritage within computer memory? So at this point, thinking about the notion of what do we have to do to store this very strange heritage that we get that doesn't really have a way to...
Sorry to interrupt again, Dr. Layton. Sorry to interrupt again. It's still on the My Journey, How Did I Get Here slide. So though we don't see the image that you're referring to.
Okay, I'm going to try this again. I'm not quite sure why this happened. Otherwise, I will. Okay. Just tell me what you can see here.
It's still blank for now.
Is it? Okay. Look, I think I'm just going to have to continue without. It's just a technology issue.
Yes.
The first time I can remember when technology has got in the way.
No problem. I think proceed, and then you can email us the presentation, which we'll share with the audience.
I can do that. Yes. Look, the two videos, but okay, I am going to. If you just hold on one moment, I'm just going to share it with Charlene to see if she can do this and see if she can present for me.
Okay.
I'll just have to find out where the presentation is. Unfortunately, the presentation is actually in a place that cannot be shared. I don't think. I will just try quickly.
Okay. What I suggest we can do is just take a 5-minute break, allow you to sort that out, and then we'll start again at 10:48.
Look, 5 minutes is going to solve it.
Okay, then you're welcome to proceed.
So let me just rather carry on, and I can walk through it. It's just a pity because the two videos I want to show are quite significant. But as I said, I'm going to pretend blind people, and I have to talk my way through.
No problem.
We deal with a lot of people in the blind sector, and their ability to catch information, to understand it, and to implement themselves is just quite incredible. And I never thought that we'd ever be in that position where blind people have got a strong visual understanding of the world without being able to see. So, okay, I'm just going to leave it. I can't seem to even share this at the moment. I'm going to put it back onto sharing anyway, and just hopefully that it can do this. So I will describe everything that can see here. So the question is, how to support intangible heritage in a computer? And I'm talking about things like recorded media, audio, video, photographs, things like even things like diaries, all of these, but the content which is important, as opposed to when we have a museum object, which is the object itself is the subject of the value. With all of the intangible heritage, content itself is the subject of the value, but that has to be stored somewhere. Tangible heritage isn't a non-existent heritage; it does exist somewhere. Unfortunately, a lot of it does exist, and especially the oral history exists in the context of people's minds and people's memories, and that is what is a very interesting discussion. The Robben Island Museum at the SAR conference. And at this particular conference in 2006, the same question arose. The people from Robben Island are passing away, and with that, their memories are going. Why are we not capturing their memories, their stories? When I spoke, I engaged with somebody from the Robben Island Museum, he said the same thing. 18 years on, why aren't we capturing the history of those the prisoners who were on Robben Island and their accounts there? And it's not happening, and it's possibly too late now. Too many of them have passed away now. We might have secondhand knowledge. Let me tell you a little bit about my team now. When I started off, and I'm guessing the transformation took around 20 years ago, And it was around about the time we were starting work and also conceptualizing a project that there was, I identified a need that there weren't many young Black women in the IT sector, and we were an IT company then. So we embarked on a process of our transformation. Our little contribution back to society was to engage with women, often people with only out of school, some with graduates, and build really. My team now consists almost exclusively of people who used to be young Black women. A couple of them are recently turned 40 now, but some have been with me now for 16 years, 18 years. And it makes me feel good that I've made a contribution to what we're doing. And in fact, our entire team working at the National Film Archive on digitization consisted of this cohort. And we're developing local capacity. We're not borrowing in from anywhere else. And we're not borrowing in from overseas. Everything we do is locally built. And I believe that this is perhaps my role in transformation in a small way, is to make a contribution back and to capacitate people. So now, what was mentioned in my CV was also the concept of eternal heritage. I want to give you a bit of a story about that, because when we were running the SARS project, and this was 2006, I was working with people you met, with David Hart, now the City of Cape Town, who was the national image manager at the time. There were, who else was there? There were quite a few other people, and a few of us went to Cyprus for one of the world's first digital heritage conferences that took place. And it really was eye-opening, and especially a presentation by IBM on the notion of eternal Egypt. And while I was sitting there, I just scribbled down something on my paper, which said, well, if it's eternal Egypt, in knowing that we were doing a heritage project, why don't we have eternal heritage? And I just happened to notice that if I take the first two letters of the first word and the first three letters of the others, it spells out the word ether. And ether is a word that has got multiple meanings, but I referred back to Aristotle's definition of the ether being the fifth force, where he talked about the four major forces of nature, and everything that combines them together is ether. And so that is how we came up with the name, and we've been trading on that name ever since. Now, in our work in the ether, over the years, we've just built up capacity in so many areas, and we really divided this to about 5 or 6 major areas. And I just want to talk briefly about the contribution that we've made and where it fits. The first one was on governance, finding that museums weren't properly governed, often weren't properly managed either, but found a lack of ability in the boards we saw. So we started moving to governance. We linked up King 4 to the codes of practice of ICOM and SAMA, and started running courses for boards to tell a board of a museum, this is how you should be governing here. What do you do? What does management do? So that we know kind of the arrangement there, and what practices do they have to follow to comply. We also then started looking at the database side, and this is where a lot of our work began on the conceptualization of SARS, where we built a pilot model that was written in Microsoft Access that was available for museums to use. We implemented it at a couple of sites, including Protoskur, and the intention was that would form the conceptual basis for the big SARS, which was going to be phase 2. Part of this, we've also then extended that into inventory models. How do you inventorize very quickly? How do you build digital repositories? And how do you even conduct digitization and trying to optimize these? We also then looked at the training side. We found there was quite a large lack in the training sector, and we developed training courses, which I believe spans almost everything. Now, in the museum sector, with one exception, is conservation. Now, early days we had conservation as a thing, but we've dropped out of that, finding that this is not a competency of ours, and there are many other much more competent people who are doing the conservation work. but we do professional development from beginning to end in this area of building up capacity. And we've trained, I don't know how many hundreds of people, I think at least 500 people on a range of courses. And then another area is what we called the experience, the ether experience, is how do museums make their stuff available to others? In Rising Artists, we started building repositories. We started helping them to put out digital strategies for making themselves available. Also with a focus on inclusion as well, is how do you make the information available to others? And it was quite interesting to go to Leeuwenhuis and see the exhibit there. It's an art exhibit for blind people, and each is in a box. And in the box, there is Braille on the top. And the goal is that the blind person reads that, opens up the box, and explains to the people with them what's in the box. Now, this is an art exhibit, but it switches things around so that the blind person becomes the competent person. The other one is the receiver of information, which is quite the opposite to what normally happens in inclusive work. Finally, with a bunch of things we believe we give back to the community. And I'll just talk briefly about some of these. One of them is called the vocabularies, which is how do we build common understanding of the work that we do? Now, this relates quite strongly to another project we finished in the last few months called the National Policy on Terminology. This was also for the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, and it looks to frame the words that we use and the mechanisms to build vocabulary so that they can be shared among a sector. Now, this is a massive challenge for the museum sector. Museum, heritage in general, cover the full range of history. Everything that we as man have created, everything in the natural world. All of these together is our scope. Therefore, we use vocabularies that cover the entire scope of the knowledge of the world. What makes this and building IT systems for the heritage sector an extremely difficult task. And I felt very privileged to be awarded that commission to develop that. I managed to pull in the country's expert, who was a retired person. And just a little idea about my team, I don't only use my young team, but I also bring in retired people from other sectors to bring their institutional memory back into the process. And here I brought Dr. Marietta Alberts, she's really the godmother of the terminology sector, and a great contribution to have her back into the sector and to help us with that. But that's something, this ether vocabularies, we give back. It's not something that we want to make money on, we share it. We've also got another project that we put together, which was a national aggregator called the Museum. I firstly presented this at the SAMA conference 6 years ago, and we've started building it, and we've separated the building during this time. This is a public portal similar to what Europeana is intended to do, a search. And our goal is to give this back to the community at the time that we hope the community is sufficiently able to accept it and to put it somewhere. And I don't know where its place would be, but we'd like to put it somewhere sometime. It's not something, again, it's free to use, free to no hosting costs at all. We fund all hosting costs for it. And that was one thing I mentioned. So this is the range of the scope that we've done. Back to the very first encounter we had, where we were awarded the commission to the SARS system 18 years ago. Now, what attracted me to the sector was one thing. I was a good computer scientist up to that point, building nice computer systems, and suddenly I hit this problem that I didn't know an answer to. And the problem is simply, how do we store data forever? Now, in the museum sector, it's very well known that conservation is a very important part. Preservation of items is important there. And you store a piece of paper, you store a museum object, it probably will still be there 400 years into the future. With data, we cannot even guarantee it 10 years into the future. So what is the nature of the challenges that is for us to store data as long as we store the objects? Given what I see as the most fundamental thing is that data about the object is at least as important as the object itself. And even if the object disappears, the data of the object should be able to continue forever. Let's have a look at items that are destroyed by a fire, irreplaceable. If we have got the data copy of it, descriptions of it, reproduction through scanning, whatever it is, then at least you've got something to say this is what happened in history. And this is why digitization is so fundamental, and clearly fundamental for two primary purposes, which are to preserve it for the future and to provide access to people who can't make it happen. Let's have a look at the National Film Library, for example. The challenge here is that to see one of the films, you actually have to go to the National Film Archives and see it on one of their existing systems. They don't let the movie, this is not a lending line. You have to go there and you have to watch it. You can't make a copy of it there. So us having digitized, we've now digitized 6,000 of the 35mm films, and our project has just come to an end in the last couple of weeks, now makes that available. And let's move a little bit now. Now, I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the projects that we've done that we believe are preparing for the future. I'm going to start with the more recent ones and then move back to these. So I talked about the digitization of film reels. Now, that only represents 5% of the entire collection. So as we move in, we're now in the closeout stage. One of our recommendations is going to be to capacitate them to be able to carry on with themselves. We've been doing capacitation for the last months. Our final capacitation is happening in the next 2 weeks, and then we do the handover. I don't even know how many people it is, but I'm guessing at least 25 people, including staff, interns, and we see their increasing competence to be able to handle this without us. Of course, we do want to keep holding hands until they can walk on their own, but we're confident that they've got the ability to manage this themselves now. I mentioned national policy on terminology, and it also mentioned the legislative review that we did last year and also finishing this year, and rewriting the Archives Act, the Legal Deposit Act, and the next noted. A great omission here is that there is no Museums Act. We can't say that the National Heritage Resources Act is a Museums Act because it's not. It really brings into being SARA itself, but doesn't tell the museum what to do. The only link is the development of the National Inventory. So we believe that there is a need for Museums Act as well to fill in that particular gap, and that's one of the recommendations I've made. We also done a lot of work on access to information by children with disabilities, because we work in both spaces, in the heritage space and in the education space. And a very important part of my to try and link these two worlds together so that we have education on the one side and we have heritage on the other. And the point that I made throughout, right at the very start, is that museums, libraries, archives, and heritage in general, the stores and repositories of knowledge that exist there, perhaps the only trusted source of knowledge that we can get. We live in that was very nice when it started, and we got access to many websites. Now we do a search or we use ChatGPT. We cannot trust what comes out. We need to now take the place and say that the museums of the world, the heritage sites of the world, all the knowledge we've got is trust. And if I could say one thing that the heritage sector as a whole has got to do in its marketing itself to society, is to focus on the word trust, to say we are the trusted source. You cannot really trust anybody else, but you can trust us. We are the custodians of that knowledge. Now, other work that we've done, we have done GRAP 103 project evaluating and inventorizing museum. I mentioned the costing of the national policy on digitization that was done. We also did the costing of the national policy on restitution and repatriation a couple of years ago. And that, and for this one, SARA was the implementing. Happy to hear that that is now, that office has now been set up. Another one that we did was the National Art Bank model, where we defined what the National Art Bank was, and that was positioned at Leeuwenhuis, and also very encouraging for us to go back there and seeing National Art Bank has been implemented, operational. It's still finding its feet. Now, this is a big thing. We do a lot of policy work, and the most tragic thing for us when a policy is written, we believe we put our heart and soul into this, is that it's never implemented. And it's very encouraging to see now that there is a shift in government thinking focusing on implementation of policy and not just writing the policy. That we did was mentioned earlier, the implementation of the heritage building regulations. Now, as it happens, these come out of the National Heritage Resources Act, but this is from the public works perspective, not from the SARA perspective. Customer here was the public works, saying what do they have to do and what do they have to capacitate themselves to meet the regulations in the National Heritage Resources Act. So these are some of the things that have positioned us. I believe that almost every one of these is planting the seeds for the future of a better heritage, and that's where we fit in. Now, at this point, I have got this movie, The Capture of the Boer Battery. Now, I don't think, tell me, Charlene, did you manage to, oh no, you can't get that, can you? You know what, Charlene, I'm just going to do something. So you still can't see my picture, can you?
No, we have not been able to see the video.
Okay.
Or the presentation.
Let me have a look here. I'm going to give you two numbers here. FA963. You know what? Let me. No, FA963. We'll just check if that's the right one here. So either 963 or 966. Then I can get Charlene to just show these movies for us. Let's just see if this is the right one. Oh, it's just one, but then that will show. Well, it's actually 963 or 966. It might have been. I think it's 966 is the one, but the other one is the after on film. It was 1949. But anyway, if you can remember which one that is, because I don't seem to have the image of it here, but about a little piece of history. Yeah, no, it's not. It's called the Zonk one, if you remember. Okay. If there's any way, Shirley, you could find those in the meantime and get those ready, perhaps. And I can do this. I've realized now I didn't keep my clock going, so I don't quite know where I am in this right now. But okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to share and just see if any possibility you can actually see this now.
Thanks. You do have 5 more minutes left, so please proceed.
How many more?
5 more minutes.
Oh, 5. Oh, gee. 5 more minutes. Okay. Yes, I'm sorry we lost a lot of time there.
No problem.
Okay, I'll tell you what I'm going to do then. I'll talk through just some of the papers that we saw there, where there was people talking about the photographic collections that were building up, virtual museums and sport heritage were being built. Digitization of bird recordings that is being done as well. A digitization of herbarium species, a lot in the natural history here. And quite interesting papers, but then we saw some others that to me were very important. And I'm going to talk about the highlight, which might not seem anything to you that is relevant to anything, but it had to do with earthworms. And what I really liked about this one was the fact that it was a practical example that was talking about knowledge of earthworms from the local schools, show them how to use this as part of the building of compost, and then from there to take it further. In other words, use it to grow vegetables, and then to take that knowledge home to their building. To me, that meant a lot. So if I've only got 5 minutes, I'm going to move straight to the end of what I'm doing. I wanted to mention one thing that was very important to us that I had wanted to go into detail on was it's a framework that we put down for the digital heritage that enables strategizing of digital heritage to take place. This was something that emerged not with SARS in 2005, where as we started finding ourselves getting more and more immersed into the digital heritage, I built a framework, and this framework was then used as the basis for the national policy. So it created a vocabulary and a structure and processes that enable us to just position the discourse taking place, the decisions that what I've called the long past and the long future, where museums started in the 1700s, highly exclusive, and now we're moving towards more inclusion into the library sector, open for all, accessible to all, and digitization should make this open to everybody, even though you're not even close to it. Of collaboration between museums taking place. The issue that I've noted during this time is, even though digital transformation has taken place, tremendous challenge of the loss of collections, museums closing, nothing happening with them, and the collections either rot there. And to me, this is completely unacceptable. We have to find any collections that are there are preserved when the institution can no longer look after them. I've just seen too many examples, some very good best practice. We're in a world now, very near future, we're going to see a shift in how computers work. We're moving away from electronic computers. Quantum will greatly radicalize what we know as AI, and it'll also allow us the ability to store different ways. Quantum computing is that computers work. It uses a quantum knowledge as opposed to the atomic knowledge of electrons. And it's quite a big shift. I see us, as we move to other areas, we're going to start doing other things that we couldn't do before. And I'll tell you, I believe, ability to talk to animals, already starting with whales, chimpanzees, and I do believe we're going to start cracking the animal code and being heritage as well as part of the global heritage that exists. We're also going to find that we start moving to other planets as well. And when we start moving to other planets, we're going to have to think about what is the heritage we're storing and where we store it. So some of the things I wanted in the near future now I'm in the closing up process, and I think we're not going to be able to show that. Charlene, if she can just show the last, it is, and one, it starts at 56th minute in the thing. This is an important one. Challenges of authenticity. This is all in the next few years, and also museum legislation. From the 20 to 50 year horizon, we're going to start seeing computing as being the de facto model of computing. We're probably going to find that the brain chips start happening, where chips have started inserting for much better interfacing. No need for external devices. There are various external things like glasses that can be used, but now already Elon Musk is working on some brain implants to help disabled people, and full immersive engagement. And the key thing, everything will be recorded at all times. As we move to the long future, I would like to see professional elevation of memory. Important job in the world is those that in memory. So this is the top of the spectrum of all qualifications. If you are one of those that preserve human memory, you are at the top three in terms of the professions of the world. Also looking at others, the advent of the robust, find more and more things that come through. But I end off with just, my end off was that presentation. Charlene, did you any chance manage to get that little thing of Nkosi Sikeleli?
No, I did not get that video.
Yeah, I did. She couldn't find it. Okay. So my suggestion is, what must we do now? And I just put down 4 statements of what we've got to do. Number 1, never stop learning. All of us every day learn something new. And as you can figure out, when I said that I've been in 18 years and it was 25%, that my next birthday I will be turning 72. I never stop learning every single day. Next thing you've got to do, share your knowledge. Don't keep your knowledge, share it with as many people as possible. Next thing is do good. Do things for society. Do things for other people. Just help them. And the final thing I say is be happy. You know, this is it. So I'm gonna try once more to see if any way I can just show you this little video. Something is happening here. Connect quickly and just very short video. If it does work, I'll be very, very happy. Just tell me if you can see anything here.
There's nothing showing yet.
Nothing showing. Okay. I'm going to try and play it to see if you can hear it, even if you can't see it. Can you hear it?
Yes, we can hear it.
Hear it? Sorry, can you hear that?
Yes, we can hear it. Say it again. Yes, we can hear it,
Okay.
but we can't see it.
It's a Sutu tribe. Show me. It's actually showing Drakensberg in the background, the Free State of people working in the fields, people tending cows, and it looks like a mushroom in the mountains, people gathering water at the stream. This is 1949. They still Okay, so look, I'm sorry about that. I could hear from Charlene that you couldn't really hear that, and you know, it really has been a problem here. I just realized this morning that we had this issue here with the sound, but I'd like to share the presentation with you, but I think what I'll do is I'll take out the two videos. I'm not allowed to share the videos further, and I wanted to thank the National Film. Let me use this. There isn't as yet for the availability of the videos, but we're starting in the process of advising on what should be the protocol for to the digitized movie as opposed to the physical movie. So I will stop at this point, and I'd like to thank you, and I hope you've done that. And for all of those that have been through this, please keep in contact with us. You know, we're not stopping work. I have been trying to retire for many years. I've now given up the prospect that that's ever going to happen. I'm just changing the way I do my work. That's all. And I'm very happy to be around and to pass on my. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Layton. And again, it's just unfortunate that the technology let us down today. So we do apologize to our guests online. We will get the presentation from Dr. Layton, and we will make it available to you. Beyond that, we as SARA actually owe him royalties for the use of the word Saurus, which is the term that he coined himself all those years ago. So we've run out of time due to the technical difficulties, and I think we'll just continue with the program. Please type any comments in the chat for Dr. Layton. And Dr. Layton, if you could also please leave your contact information in the chat so that all of our guests know how to get in touch with you for future collaboration. Thank you so much, Dr. Layton. We're going to move on to our next.
I'll do that.
Yes.
I just must say, I cannot stay for the rest of the program.
Okay.
But I will definitely, I'm hoping that some of my other staff can do that.
All right.
And I'll leave my details here. If anybody wants to contact me for anything, will be great. I've already engaged with Jake, for example, about seeing what I can do to help with the new SARS as well.
Yes.
So let's hope that there is something there. Thank you again, everybody, for this.
Thank you so much. And again, we will get the presentation from you and share it with all of our guests online. And in terms of the actual rest of this presentation, it will be available on YouTube as well. All right, let's move on to our next.
Thank you so
much. Thank you, Dr. Layton. Our next speaker is Dr. Sadiq Motala. Dr. Motala is a senior lecturer in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Cape Town. He is the academic lead of Global Digital Heritage Africa, abbreviated as GDHA, a research group dedicated to the digital preservation, virtualization, and research of African heritage. He is a trained land surveyor and holds a PhD in education. His research interests are spatial, temporal mapping, 3D heritage preservation, storytelling, posthumanism, and socially just pedagogies in engineering education. He co-edited Higher Education Hauntologies, Living with Ghosts of Justice to Come. And I'd also like to add, personally, that he has been a very good friend of Sarah's for the last several years. He has helped us with our mapping of Boer Cup during the declaration of several sites in the Boer Cup. He helped us with the mapping of District 6. He has conducted numerous research for us, especially giving us GIS and spatial data. And also, quite passionately, he hasn't included it in his bio, he has worked with the community of District 6 in conserving the memory of the space. Of course, we had a very tragic incident that took place there in the past. So Dr. Motala today is wearing his second hat, which is that of Global Digital Heritage Africa. And again, he's a very good friend of Sarah. He's sitting right next to me today. Over to you, Dr. Motala.
Great. Thank you, Ben. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the management of Sarah. And good morning to all guests and dignitaries. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully you can see it.
Yes, no technical difficulties.
Yes, is that okay?
Perfect. Oh no, switch. Yeah.
So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about work that we've been doing since our formation, that is Global Digital Heritage Africa. We've only formed this year, and I thought I'd share some of the examples of what it is that we've been doing and hopefully some of our plans going forward. Okay, so GDHA brings together a diverse group of people on a site-specific basis. It's a three-tier system, and the top tier is our core team, which is based at the Faculty of Engineering in the Built Environment at UCT, consisting of myself. We've got Roshan, Bruce, and Ralph, who I think are in the presentation today also. Then we are an affiliate of Global Digital Heritage, which is the second tier, which is an international. And our team have worked already on several projects already. This year they went to the UAE. They've done some work in Sharjah, Scotland, and they'll be doing several other trips soon. And the last tier of partners who we work with on a site-specific project. So students, obviously, the city of Cape Town. Hopefully we'll work with SARA soon, the West Coast Fossil Park, Deflector community, District 6 community, Cape Nature, etc. And I'll show you some of these examples as we go along. Okay, so in terms of our objectives, we have several objectives. To the digital documentation of heritage sites, collections, and landscapes. We focus on, but are not restricted to, African heritage. We also conduct multi- and transdisciplinary research by working with a diversity of disciplines like archaeology, of course, film and media studies, computer science, archives, education, etc., and we contribute to public discourse. And on the right there is a picture of a student of mine, Tlotliso, with two members of the defluctor community outside of Lukhoff School in Stellenbosch, and communities, groups, and sites who were historically silenced to preserve their tangible and intangible heritage by means of inspirational digital storytelling. After all, research tells stories. And in a field like digital heritage, there is the potential for many amazing stories. And when we scan a site, we try to find a story of interest. So here's a picture on the left of our laser scanner in front of a rock face containing sand rock art in the Cederberg. And by putting the photograph through this thing called a D-stretch filter, enhances the ancient paint and allows us to see that what we wouldn't be able to see with the naked eye. So on the right, if you look closely at the enhanced picture, you'll see there's an eland's body, a little elephant. If you can see my cursor there, there's a small elephant there, and also a human figure. So what is the story? We can follow specific lines of questioning to get to the story. So a post-colonial lens asks, what were the omissions in the canonical story? For example, what was the indigenous knowledge that played a role in the development of something? So like Khoi words in Afrikaans. What about Khoisan medicine that became known as Dutch medicine or Dutch remedies? What was the imported knowledge that was brought here by the slaves? So things like South African cuisine that has slave cook sisters and fish cakes built. And what knowledge was it? A post-humanist lens asks, what did non-human actors play in the development of South Africa? So for example, well-placed land, like in District 6, had agency and was sought after by the apartheid and colonial authorities. What about things like gold and diamonds and other minerals? What roles did they play? A genealogical lens developed as a process and doesn't see things, events that were contingent on other processes. Also, an engineering viewpoint looks at the technology and how it can solve specific problems. So in explaining more about what we do, I thought that I'd like to tell partial stories about sites that we scanned or are researching. They're partial stories because they contain many questions. And I'm afraid in this presentation, it contains many questions. So I'll tell the story chronologically. Let's start at the beginning. 5.2 million years ago, there was a rich concentration of animals living in this area, which would become the West Coast Fossil Park, one of the richest fossil sites in the world. Bones of over 200 types of animals, many of them new to science, were discovered here. One of the mammal fossils is of the short-necked, long-horned giraffe called the civethere. The remains of over 500 different individual civetheres were found here. And surely many more would come because there's much more to excavate. They literally and figuratively, I suppose, scratching the surface. So in June this year, we scanned fossil beds at the park using our ZNF scanner and a Canon camera for texturing. That's Roshan standing there in his socks, taking photographs that will accompany the laser scans. The final products are photorealistic, metrically accurate 3D models. We produced one very high resolution 3D model of approximately 1 million triangles. And the full resolution results are actually quite stunning. So here's two photographs of the models. There is much that archaeologists can tell us by looking at these scans. And at such a resolution, you can see things like individual cracks on even the smallest bones. And here's a little GIF of the models that we published online on our Sketchfab collection. So you can take a tour by looking at various things, like here's a civethere foot bone, a civethere leg, a giraffe jaw, the remains of a seal flipper, There's a Cervithia rib and 2 whale vertebrae. And lastly, there's a hippo tooth. So these models are published on Sketchfab, and you can take a tour of them. You can sort of fly around the model, and you can put a VR headset on, and you can view this in VR. And speaking to the archaeologists there, what's interesting is that not much work is done on these bone beds. Less than 5% material has been properly studied. There are still many more stories to tell here. And I wonder why so little work has been done on such a prehistoric treasure trove. Perhaps it's an issue of capacity, manpower. One of our core aims is the democratization of knowledge, and we make our data freely available. So GDH and GDHA, that's the two of us, we are the largest producer of documentation in the world on Sketchfab, which is the biggest online platform that hosts 3D models. Here is the web address. If you want to, if you just type that in, and if you search for global digital heritage, and find our collection. And all the models that I show here are freely available on our Sketchfab collection, and you can download them and you can do whatever you like. The next story takes us to 200,000 years ago. We have documented several rock art sites around the Western Cape already, and the next story takes us to Piers Cave in the Fishhook Valley. We went there earlier this year, and we 3D scanned the cave, which is on top of the mountain in the picture, in the top left picture there. According to archaeologists, there have been people living in Piers Cave for possibly 100 to 200,000 years. It's an extremely important site. It's the only rock art site in the whole of Cape Town, and indeed the whole of the Cape Peninsula. But the art itself is underwhelming because it's in a very bad state of preservation. In fact, if you go there, you might even miss it altogether if you didn't know that there was rock art there. Another important point about Piers Cave is that it could have been occupied by Auchomato, who was the famous Khoi interpreter during the time of Van Riebeeck. There are very few caves in the country that have yielded the full sequence of evidence from earlier through middle through to later Stone Age. However, the original excavation of the cave was in the 1920s by Victor Piers and his son. They were enthusiasts, not really trained archaeologists. And at the time of its excavation, it had an exceptionally deep deposit. They used spades, picks, and dynamite also. And here's a page from the Cape Times of 1928 covering the exciting find. Some archaeologists say that it was a haphazard excavation with only a representative sample of stone implements and other artifacts kept. 6 meters of material was moved from the cave, and most of it was tipped down the mountain slope, where it still lies to this day. In fact, it's not uncommon if you go there, you'll find stone tools on the side of the mountain, including 4 children. They were buried there with pendants and ostrich eggshell beads. Some of the objects ended up in the Fishhook Museum, the Fishhook Valley Museum, and others at Iziko. We've partnered up with the Fishhook Valley Museum and Iziko to digitize some of the many artifacts that were excavated there. So we went to Iziko a few weeks ago with our lightbox and turntable, and we scanned around 50 objects and produced the models in 2 days. And here's a shell pendant on the top left. It's ancient jewelry, and a stone tool on the bottom right. What's good about this is that although the artifacts found in Piers Cave are in 2 different places, that is, in the Fishhook Valley Museum and in the Iziko Museum, they can be brought together digitally. So you can go to our page on Sketchfab and see all the objects under the one collection called the Fishhook Valley Collection. Now I'll show you a little tour of the cave itself. Let's just wait for it to come up. Here's the 3D model of the cave. You can see that it's a photorealistic model. And you can see, you can visit the areas where there's rock art, which is in very poor condition. So there's some rock art there that has been put through the D-stretch filter. That one there looks like some hands. And the last rock art is a very interesting pattern with some dots and another figure in the front. So today, as I said, some archaeologists lament the destruction of what they call the destruction of Pierre's Cave. Here's an apt quote from a recent book. It says, "What a strange fate to have overtaken the dead of Pierre's Cave. The lessons here are all in one direction. We send up our voices to the cave on the hill. In the answering echo, we hear only ourselves." Why does information about the excavation of the early 20th century who lived in Fishhoek, who occupied this place for thousands and thousands of years? How much more would we know about our First Nations people and culture if they're human? Note in this newspaper article from the time that these remains were represented and ultimately disrespected. And why is the exquisite collection of art on our landscape not given the protection that it deserves? Okay, so equipment. In order to be able to carry out a job like this, we use cutting-edge equipment like GPS, drones, cameras, laser scanners, light box, and turntables. And the last picture there is of the light box and turntable. With that, we're able to digitize small museum objects like the Fishhoek and Iziko. And what we're doing right now is we're currently training students to carry out this work, which will increase our capacity. So let's go to the next story. Our next story takes us to the mid-1800s in the Karoo. During the mid to late 1800s, the Great Trek was happening, where Boers migrated into the interior of South Africa. The general story is of the Great Trek is that it follows the tensions between the Boers and the British, as well as the Ndebele and the Zulus. The lesser-known story is of the northern frontier, where Trek Boers slowly moved through the Karoo, encountering San and Khoi people. About 100 years later, scholars started to be interested in these abandoned core belt buildings on farms across the Karoo and attributed them to the Trek Boers. Recent research on the Cape frontiers suggests that they are a Creole architectural style that came about in the interaction of settlers, mixed-race people, and the indigenous Khoi and San. So here is a scan of one of the core belt buildings that we did at a farm near Loxton in the Karoo. As you can see, it's a textured photorealistic 3D model that we produced. And here, I'm just going to wait for it to run through. Okay, and then the next slide is of a panorama tour of the site, which is slightly different to a 3D model, but these panorama tours can be produced with 360-degree cameras. So you can visit the site, you can see the surrounding landscape, you can go into one of the rooms. So here's a view. And now we're entering the room, we're looking around in the actual building. And you can walk around. So what is the real story behind these enigmatic igloo-like structures? Who built them? Who lived in them? And why do these buildings remind us of late Iron Age Bantu buildings and kraals found in the interior of South Africa, and also of the Khoi huts that were documented by the early European settlers? Our next story starts in 1796 on a farm that is now located next to UCT in Cape Town. In 1796, a small windmill was built on the farm Welgelegen, owned by a farmer called Gijsbert van Rienen. This was 1 year after the Battle of Muizenberg, when the British took control of the Cape from the Dutch. So it must have been an interesting time for Dutch farmers like van Rienen. Although the archive states that it was built by van Rienen, a wealthy man, it was obvious and it was probably built by his slaves. What were the names of these slaves? What knowledge did they have? And what knowledge did they gain by building this piece of medieval engineering? It was used to mill wheat. It is now the last remaining working windmill in Africa, more than 220 years old. Let's fast forward to 2020. The GDHA team, when they were employed at their previous project called the Zamani project, laser scanned the mill. As it was during COVID, the Zamani team could not travel, so decided to scan a building on their doorstep. Mostard's Mill, of course, is right next to UCT. You'd probably recognize this if you drive on the M3 and look to your left, driving out of town. This proved to be an incredible stroke of good luck, because an incredible stroke of bad luck was about to happen. In April 2021, the UCT fire burned down the Jagger Library and burnt down other buildings in UCT. And of course, it burnt down poor Mostard's Mill. Now, because of the scans, the friends of Mostard's Mill could get the information that they needed to be able to rebuild it. Things like the dimensions of the different pieces, the designs of the components, etc., were able to be gleaned from the 3D scans. So here's some pictures that the friends of Mostard's Mill in the reconstruction of the mill. Here's another picture, and then there's an interesting blog that's on the internet about the reconstruction of Mostard's Mill. Here's another view of the model from the inside. And here's another view. And by the way, this is not photographs. These are views. So you can see that they're photorealistic model views. 2024, this year, we, that is GDHA, went there and we rescanned the mill after it was rebuilt. And the view of, we also scanned some of the old farm implements that were used during the time. You can see Ralph and Bruce there on the right-hand side, scanning them with a handheld laser scanner. And here's the result of the latest scan. You can see that's a cutaway of the mill. So I currently have a master's student who's looking at the mill from a civil engineering perspective, and an undergraduate student too. So let's go to the next story. It happens in 1901. In 1901, a remarkable scientist called Henri Foucault presents a paper to the South African Philosophical Society in Cape Town called On a Stereoscopic Measurement of Photographic Survey. It establishes a new theory of 3D measurement and mapping. He was the first person to postulate the theory of stereophotogrammetry, maps from stereoscopic photography. So in 1904, he took a pair of photographs of Devil's Peak. That's for those of you who are not from Cape Town, it's the peak on the left-hand side from Signal Hill, which is the hill in the foreground of the picture. And he took a few pictures of Devil's Peak. Here is the historic pair of photographs, as well as the historic map which he produced. And this map is the first instance of photogrammetric mapping in the world. Years later, around the world would be founded on 3D mapping, which was invented, I'm happy to say and proud to say, in Cape Town. Foucault bequeathed all his equipment and the historic map to the Department of Surveying at UCT. And we scanned some of the equipment. Here's Bruce again at the bottom, scanning with a handheld Artec Leo laser scanner. The models, including the Foucault stereo projector on the left-hand side, as well as the Foucault surveying camera on the right-hand side. That's the one that actually took the historic photos. I wonder how many historic pieces like this are collecting dust in basements around the country, or worse still, how many of them have been destroyed. So my last story takes us back to apartheid. 1948 to 1994, and to two sites that were very similar. Then I had to say something about District 6. I couldn't leave it out. One is well known, District 6 on the left-hand side, and the other is not so well known as District 6, Flactor, that's on the right. So my student is currently working on the development of a methodology that I call counter-surveying. And counter-surveying involves temporarily marking out the sites of forced removal and taking people back to the location from where they were forcibly removed. So here I am on the left with Mark Jacobs and his sister Isabel, who lived in 6 Eckhart Street in District 6, which was demolished. They are standing on the exact location of where their house was. You can see I used cones and chalk to mark the location. And this is what their house at 6 Eckhart Street used to look like. And here is the ghost of their house imposed over the current location, exactly where it would have stood. So we are able to do this counter-surveying methodology by combining traditional surveying and mapping with archival research. And in doing counter-surveying, we are also capturing a new spatial archive. So there's a relatively rich archive of materials of District 6. On the top left picture is an old council map of Eckhart Street showing the house in pink. On the right-hand side is one of many aerial images of District 6 over the years. This one, I think, is from 1968. This is when the first and forced removals, that was around that time. Then on the bottom left and bottom middle, the bottom left is a picture of their house. You can actually see it with the sort of diamond shape at the top. And the bottom middle is a picture of the site after their house was demolished. And then on the bottom, we did to find the exact location. So in places like District 6, information, that's my point here. And like what we did in District 6, we went to Die Flactor in Stellenbosch, and we took Mr. Muhammad Ras, that's him standing on the top, back to the location of his house in Die Flactor in Stellenbosch. He lived in 107 Andringa Street, Die Flactor. And like in District 6, we captured his stories about life in Die Flactor. Roger spoke about this earlier on, about the digitization of stories, which is very much what we do here in the counter-surveying methodology. Unlike District 6, there is very little information. There is only one grainy aerial photograph of the area and only one photograph of his house. That's the picture. In the old photo on the left, there's a woman standing outside Mr. Ras's front door, and I've just circled it there in red. So all those buildings would have been demolished to make way for Stellenbosch and the buildings of the town center of Stellenbosch. On the right-hand side picture is Mr. Ras standing in exactly the same spot in 2024. What is evident from these two exercises, that is the counter-surveying District 6 and in Stellenbosch, is that there's a lot of historical data in some areas like District 6, whereas in other areas like Die Flactor, there is very little data. And there are so many areas of forced removal across South Africa, and the government of the time did not want to draw attention to the trauma of Black people and actively tried to erase some of the people. And this erasure happened from the very start of mapping. So I want to imagine several possibilities. Firstly, I'd like to do a virtual reconstruction of areas like District 6 and Die Flactor as they were. Of course, and I know it's currently being done on a small scale. So Isak later on will present on the work that he's been doing with. So in this slide are 3 pictures of the immediate neighborhood of Mark and Isabel's house in Eckhart Street. And I imagine that by combining these images with mapping data, we can produce, at least in part, a 3D model of what the area used to look like. And with machine learning, I wonder if it's possible for a computer to ingest all the images for example, in the District 6 Museum archive, and then produce a 3D model of District 6 prior to demolition. What about the insides of the building? So we are hoping that some computer science students at UCT would take up the challenge. We posed it to them, but so far but we're hoping that at some point in the future, we'd be able to do this virtual reconstruction, particularly of District 6. Another possibility, reunification, bringing together objects virtually. African heritage objects are scattered all over the world, but they belong at home, of course, or with their partner objects. For example, there are royal objects from the Hlubi kingdom in different places. So on the left here is King Langalibalele's axe and a mat that came from his wife on the right-hand side. So we can bring these together virtually and put them in one collection. Other objects that belong to him may be in the British Museum. And let's face it, it's unlikely to be returned. But with this technology, we can do a virtual return and display them together. As an example of virtual reunification, we scanned the All Souls Chapel in the Maitland Cemetery recently, and in it we found this statue of the Virgin Mary, and her hands had been broken off. That's me on the right-hand side, holding up her hands. And in the middle picture is the 3D model of the Virgin Mary without her hands. So what we are able to do in 3D is we're able to reunify her with her hands. And here's the 3D model of the Virgin Mary with her hands shown on our Sketchfab collection. Now, this is a small act, but you can imagine the implications on dignity that similar acts can achieve with other objects that are scattered around the world. So I'm almost at the end of my presentation, and I've got some questions. So why tell these stories? Doing the heritage from within, doing this sort of heritage work from within academia must be based on an ethical stance. We take and Mr. Ras back to their houses, and experience, but it's a painful experience too. But hopefully it's a healing one. But are we doing it for their benefit? How can we use these technologies to benefit the people who were dispossessed during apartheid? They are still alive. Or, being heritage work, is it for the benefit of the people who are after? What about foregrounding the stories of ancestors who are long gone? Who benefits from this? So in reading Eve Tuck, I have to ask some difficult questions like of District 6 and defluctor and colonization. Why am I only looking at the pain of Black people? Eve Tuck says, much of social science research has been concerned with documenting damage. And damage-centered researchers operate primarily and often benevolently with the assumption that harm to Black people must be recorded and proven. But what this does is it leads to a morbid fascination in the academy of retelling stories of pain. But academic work is more than this. More than focusing on the pain that we or our families were subjected to by apartheid. Black people are more than pain. Many ex-residents have worked through the pain and have gone on to that have driven them. And it makes me think of desire-based research, which can be seen as an antidote to damage-centered research. She says, desire-based research are concerned with understanding complexity, contradiction, and the self-determination of presenting not only the painful elements of social reality, but also the wisdom and hope. Such an axiology is intent on depathologizing the experiences of dispossessed and disenfranchised communities, so that people are seen as more than broken and conquered. That is to say, communities are broken and conquered. They are so much more than that. There was Black excellence in the past, but it just reported on in ways that made it always in relation to whiteness. There is a new generation of caring, connected, and smart Black students who are technologically switched on and can excel in this digital work. With one sympathetic eye on the past, they are able to move bravely into the future with laser scanner in hand and computer in the other hand. Of course, more can be done to promote digital heritage, but I am optimistic when I see the way that students are responding to this, especially to this sort of work, digital. And lastly, in closing, I'd like to invite you to contact us if you need our services, like any 3D scanning work that needs to be done, or if you feel like you could partner up with us in any research. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you so much, Dr. Motala. You know, every time I see your research, I feel like I'm a primary school student again. My joy is on the floor, and you never cease to amaze me. I really thank you for everything that you've done. People are already typing in the comments. Please continue to do so. I have a lot of questions myself and comments, and then I'm just going to start that off with my questions and comments. You're welcome to raise your hands as well. And please use the comment section again to engage with Dr. Motala now while we have him. Now, the first and most important thing for me was just looking at that timeline and how you were able to narrate a story starting from 33 million years ago, then to 200,000 years ago, sorry.
Yeah.
Then we look at the 18th century, and then we come to the 20th century as well. I think that alone, again, we spoke about this earlier informally when we're having our chat, just about the need for having these spaces that curate such stories. I mean, even a presentation such as yours, which is then accessible to more South Africans. I think, again, very much important is the issue of redress, which you are touching on. I think what you spoke about towards the end about pain-based research versus desire-based research, I think is also quite important, because how are we now shaping these narratives of what happened in spaces that no longer exist or were completely destroyed? So those are my few comments. I've got a lot more, but I'll give other people a chance as well. And then in terms of my question to you, number one, it would be about South Africa currently lacking a cohesive policy or framework to bring all of this digital work together. We had Dr. Layton earlier. We've got Mr. Potgieter coming later on. So how do we bring all of that work together? What kind of policy framework does South Africa need? Maybe also what type of resources do we need? How do we make this something that becomes I'd say a pillar of heritage management within South Africa? And then the next question is about the mustard mill. We were with our colleagues from Heritage Western Cape. It's a provincial heritage site, and they were quite excited about the restoration work. And I remembered that there were 3D scans that were done, which allowed that restoration work to continue. So how important do you think it is to have this type of 3D mapping done for maybe sensitive, very old buildings, just in terms of conservation management? Those are my two questions for now, and then we'll get to the comments.
Thank you, Ben. So to answer your question on legislation, I'm afraid I don't know. I leave the legislation up to people like yourselves. But of course, we can have an input into that. I mean, just in terms of the practicalities of having something like a digital archive, in a place like South Africa, we were talking about China earlier on, that is still relatively resource poor. We really have to up our game. I mean, we at GDHA are grappling now with the issue of storage space, something as simple as that. I mean, to be able to host 3D models like this, or even to produce 3D models like this, we need huge amounts of storage space. And not just now, but for perpetuity, I suppose, because we need to be able to host these models online. So there's certainly challenges with regards to that, and I think legislation needs to think about that also, not just from a philosophical or historical point of view. Now, of course, the importance of 3D mapping as an archive. I mean, the Mostert Mill example is a perfect example of that, because had the team not scanned it, we would never have been. It would not have been able to have been rebuilt in the way that it was able to be rebuilt. I mean, another example is something like the Maitland Cemetery, the All Souls Chapel that I showed you an example of, the Mother Mary statue. That church is falling into disrepair right now. People are not, because they're not using it. And when things are not being used, vandalism happens, stuff gets stolen from there. And our 3D scan is a bit of a snapshot in time. So while things are being stolen from the chapel, which they are, I believe, at least we can have a record of as it was at the beginning of 2024, for example.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to get to the comments and then I'll get to my questions afterwards. And I will invite you as well to speak. There's a very long comment from Nancy who says the counter surveying project at D6 was so interesting. A 3D will provide so much more insight into what was lost with the forced removals. Very much agree. With the restitution of heritage objects and 3D printing, I believe the items must be returned to their owners and that those museums can put 3D printed copies of the originals in their museums. Very good point as well. It was lovely to see what the scanning of Mustard Mill did to assist its rebuild. Joanna Marks, an expert in mills, also an ex-colleague of ours at SARA, wrote books and worked after retirement at Mustard Mill. Nancy, I'm just going to invite you to come onto the platform, and other colleagues and people online, you're welcome to raise your hands, write your comments. Nancy, just a few more comments to elaborate. Thank you for the very lovely comment.
Hi, morning. Thank you, Ben. Well, yeah, I'm sorry I put a bit of a mouthful down there, but the presentation covered so many interesting aspects of digital heritage. It's like I wanted to make a comment on every little bit that was presented because it was really, really so interesting. And yeah, maybe all I can say is good luck with all the ventures that you do for heritage in this digital space. And I hope you get the support and resources needed for them, but also the District 6 one, fabulous what can be done with the technology. And thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much, Nancy. So from my side, again, I do have a few more questions. And one maybe is more practical now. We're scanning buildings, we're scanning resources. What are the limitations, or are there any? And do we need some kind of framework to manage intellectual property rights? I understand that these are heritage resources. I understand that some of these resources are privately owned, but are we looking at questions around intellectual property rights? And then again, even in terms of the benefit to some of these, maybe not current owners, but those individuals who this heritage belonged to in the past. What are your thoughts around that? And then another question which I had is just based on our conversation earlier as well. How would you imagine if you had all the resources in the world and DSAC gave us lots of money? How would you imagine curating such work or collections, scans would look in the future?
Wow, quite a few questions. So, okay, so on intellectual property rights, just the way that we work right now is that if people approach us to do any heritage work, heritage scanning, our first condition and our main condition is that whatever we produce needs to be freely available to the
Fantastic,
world.
Yeah.
Freely downloadable, and if not, sorry, we can't do it. It's largely, primarily an educational tool, and we need it to be able to be shared. So things like sensitive information and sensitive sites. I'm also thinking about the display of human remains, for example, and I was hesitant to show the old newspaper clipping, but I showed it because it's in the public domain. But yeah, as times evolve, the ethics change, and we've got to really be cognizant of this. Just thinking about the showing of, say, mummies in the Egyptian museum, for example. These are dead bodies of your kings and queens from back in the day, and perhaps people might change their views on how these things might be displayed. The second question was around what could be
with infinite resources.
We would love to be able to digitize all the heritage, and produce a digital model of everything together with. And by the way, we don't just produce 3D models. We also produce these annotations on the models that are effectively stories about the models. So you can zoom in and you can click on something and it will say, okay, hippo tooth, or here's a Savathier rib bone, or whatever, that kind of thing. So it's interesting to people. So it's an educational tool also. But I love what you saw in China about the 3D model and the artifact being right there. So you see the artifact, and then you're able to rotate the 3D model and view it, digitally. That would be wonderful. But that, of course, it requires huge amounts of resources, holographic lenses, and all of that kind of stuff. But what I would like also is to have training done to lots of young people who are able to go out there and digitize. And look, digitizing is getting easier and easier. Soon we might get to a point where someone with their phone might go and just be able to digitize something in 3D. But of course, we would love to train these people to be able to do that right now. And of course, bring to the fore the important stories. Like for me personally and for our group, the important stories are the stories that have been silenced in the past. So these subjugated knowledges, as it were. Stories like District 6, Defluctor, Khoisan stories. These are stories that we are just kind of grasping at right now. But we have a great opportunity with ex-residents who are dying off, who are directly exposed to forced removal and subject to forced removal, and we need to capture all their stories.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm just going to go to the chat. I'll take the last comment here. And if you and your team could please leave your contact details in the chat as well, so that I see there's a lot of my colleagues from Robben Island, Heritage Western Cape, other institutions that may want to work with you following this presentation. And then from Jake, he says the forward-facing long-term storage of digital resources is a challenge that will only grow with time. For high-fidelity 3D assets, this is even more true. In the South African context, I think there is scope for different actors in the space to discuss challenges and opportunities. Thank you so much, Jake. I actually want to invite you as well to just maybe elaborate a little bit more. Dr. Motala is here right now. Please go ahead, and then I'll take your hand in Tate Matita.
Dr. Motala, thank you so much for the presentation. As I said before, every time I see that, I see the work that GHA is doing, I find it to be fascinating, and it's got a healthy dose of kind of wonder that digital assets are able to inject into the heritage space. The opportunity in terms of its possible spaces, being able to create things at massive scale down to fine detail, I find that to be an incredible tool with which to characterize these sorts of things, and then grounding that in human stories. But just to speak to my comments, so as you may know, I'm part of the team responsible for the national inventory at SARA, and we handle a lot of the databasing for heritage resource information. And a consistent question that we get when engaging, especially with the public, is the inventory able to handle 3D assets? And the answer is always technically yes, but it's not currently active because the assets have a massive footprint in terms of the storage kind of outlay. And so we need to be very careful on how we add those into the system. And so I find it interesting with the conversations around especially high fidelity 3D assets, but then also looking at high fidelity but other spatial data that may cover large areas, things like multi-beam sonar, for instance, these sorts of things, which also operate in, that potentially characterize heritage and operate in 3D digital spaces that have these large footprints. And so I do wonder about, especially considering, kind of the challenges that you touched on in the South African context, for having conversations around the actors within the heritage sector and also within the sector of high fidelity 3D capture around the ways that we can store the information, the standards that are adopted, the format that these sorts of things are retained, and then finding ways to have the formats that are used in the industry be accessible and useful, but also possibly having backups that might be less accessible, but are more stable for long term, for future generations that might want to have access to these sorts of things. Because if they're properly managed, the resources, the digital resources can last forever, but the actual physical resources might not. And so the digitization of a heritage resource may be the only time that is captured in that way. And then an opportunity in the future may not exist. And so the responsibility is not just to be responsible custodians for the heritage, but also for the resources that are created from the heritage. And I think I think it's a little larger than the platform that we can have today, but I do think that is a conversation that needs to be had in the South African context. And I think there's a lot of challenges, but I think there's a lot of really interesting opportunities out there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jake. Dr. Motala?
Yeah, thank you, Jake. I mean, you brought up a lot of very salient points there. Because this work is still kind of cutting edge work, standards absolutely need to be developed. But as I said, storage space is a big issue for us. And I mean, post-COVID, we thought that prices would go down, but actually we're finding things are moving in the opposite direction. So how do we do this? And we also want to be able to keep the raw data. So just to take a step back, there's raw data, and then there's data that you work on the raw data and then you produce the final products. So the final products may be like the 3D models that I showed you, but the raw data is a lot more, it's a lot bigger, but needs to be stored, because we know as technology improves, we'll be able to do more with this raw data and produce even more interesting stuff. So we don't want to get rid of the raw data too. We currently in talks with this new initiative, which is called DIRISA, which I believe they provide storage space for educational, and it's a government initiative, but we still having teething problems there, and I'm happy to hear that SADA is also working on storage space, so perhaps we might be able to piggyback off that at some point in the future. But yeah, thank you. Thanks for your comments, Jake.
Thank you so much, Jake. I'm going to take the last comment just for the sake of time from Tate Madida, and then we'll move on to our next speaker. Go ahead, Tate.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you so much for that wonderful presentation that's been given. I think it's very strange that just as I was thinking, you touched the issue of human remains, which I think is a very, very sensitive one, but also very important, because those were human beings that need to be humanized, need to technology is becoming sort of is advancing leaps and bounds in terms of either facial reconstruction of what the person is assumed to have been. I'm now interested in terms of the social impact of this, given our history, of where we've come from, the impact in terms of perhaps opening an avenue of healing in a way. I mean, like, for example, you took the lady that was in the picture back to District 6, where the house no longer existed, and I'm interested in the sort of, in that interaction that once the product has been done and the issue has been superimposed, what's the sort of social impact of your work that you're doing, and where do you see it going in terms of trying to address some of the very, very raw and sensitive issues, because I mean, the issue of District 6 is still alive today, in the memories, particularly of in its legacy, but also in the memories of those that were that were there. Now, how does this play a cathartic role in terms of trying to either build communities, bring them together, etc., etc.? How do you see this playing out? And then lastly, perhaps there are certain, and sort of touching back on the issue of the human remains, there are people that sort of disappeared really, without a trace. And would this be a possibility looking into the future, based on some of the things that the sort of historical archival material that may be available, to try and sort of venture into that space, or it is too sensitive at this point?
Thank you so much. I think those are some very good questions that you've asked. Thankfully, I don't have to answer them, Dr. Muthala.
I was hoping you would. Thank you, Mr. Madida, for the questions. So I'll try to touch on your second one first, which is about the repatriation of human remains. You know, there's a lot being done around the world at the moment. This seems to be quite a topic of interest right now. And I know that there was work done at UCT, for example, where the human remains of several people were repatriated recently, and of course Diana Ferris spoke about Hartman yesterday or the other day. Yeah. So yeah, I'm afraid I'm not really qualified to be able to speak about that, but I mean how we can help and how we have helped with the UCT, or the team has helped with the UCT one, is the mapping of the locations of perhaps where these people would have come from, trying to find the location of the graves or gravestones, or whatever place. If there's a spatial element to it, if there's a place element, this sort of research can assist. Coming back to social impact of the work that I've been doing in District 6 over the years, I first started this work because I came in as a map maker, and I said, I can help you. I first started it off with approaching ex-residents, and they were talking about place, and often they would argue amongst each other to say, no, things were there, no, it was there, it was actually here. They were arguing about where things were, and I said, actually, I can tell you exactly where it was based on GIS. And that's how it started off. And then I offered people, do you want to know where you exactly lived? Let me take you back. And I took them back. And of course, that counter-surveying then sort of took on a life of its own, where other people started being interested in it and telling their stories. So I've started creating an archive, but also a spatial archive where we're building the map up, where we're putting dots on the map based on the stories of what people have said. So we took Mark and Isabel back, but we didn't just add their stories, we added the stories of the people who lived in their neighborhood. And of course, something like District 6 was very much a community. So you hear the community stories, and this leads to more stories, and it has a kind of a snowball effect, which basically means that the archive can grow. Having said that too, is that working with ex-residents, it's not all positive. There are ex-residents who I've worked with, and eventually they go through the process and they say, actually, it's too painful. I'm sorry. I don't want you to publish it. I don't want you to just erase everything. And of course, we have to respect their wishes. So some people are, I don't want to use the word braver, but some people are more willing to share the information than others. It comes with a lot of negativity also, which is why I also pose the question, does this really heal? Why? I mean, these are more kind of philosophical questions that I'm asking myself recently. Why are we doing this? Whose benefit is it for? And if it's heritage work, then maybe it's not for your benefit. If you've been through this traumatic experience, maybe it's for the benefit of the people who come after you, and you will speak to them as an ancestor. Yeah, that's basically it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muthala. Thank you all so much for your comments, questions. You're welcome to continue using the chat. Bruce McDonald has put the names of the GDHA team in the chat. So to all the colleagues, partners, institutions who are wanting to work with Dr. Mutala and his colleagues, you have their contact information in the chat. Thank you so, so much. And I could speak to you for 3 hours, so I'm not going to do that to the audience. So we will move on to our next speaker. What I suggest we do, we just take a 5-minute intermission, 4 minutes, so we can set up for Mr. Isaac. And then after that, we will go through the last chat for today. So we'll return at 10 minutes past 12. Thanks. Thank you and welcome back from your very short break. Today is our very last, this is now our last presentation for today. And I have the privilege and pleasure of introducing a gentleman who is doing absolutely fascinating work, which I think also really ties into the work that Dr. Mutala, who presented earlier, speaks to the same issues of redress. It speaks to issues around pain and trying to reconstruct spaces that are no longer there. Mr. Isaac Potgieter, soon to be doctor, is a PhD candidate at the University of Johannesburg and founder of Glassbox 3D. His work focuses on representing heritage and indigenous knowledge systems in virtual reality. Some of his work includes a memory of Sophiatown, a VR experience of Sophiatown as remembered by the people who lived there before its demolition, and ethnoastronomy, a VR experience recording sand myths of the night sky. So as I mentioned, I met Isaac. I had the privilege of meeting him in Johannesburg earlier this year. His work is absolutely brilliant, and I think you will be as blown away of it as I was. So over to you, Isaac, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just confirm if everyone can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much for that introduction. And you see my screen.
Yes, no technical issues.
Wonderful. That's a first.
Fantastic.
I would love to join today, but I'm here in Johannesburg, and I'm happy to be here. Main Museum. I've been working on a virtual reality recreation or representation of what Sophiatown might have looked like before its demolition. And this has been a project that's been ongoing since 2021 at this point. So here you can see a short snippet of the experience. It's been exhibited at the Trevor Huddleston Center multiple times, and I will play a longer video and demo of it later in the presentation. So I asked myself if this work in virtual reality, how can the stories, interviews, memories be used as data in a representation of both the tangible and the intangible aspects of cultural heritage sites, using Sophiatown circa 1955 study. But of course, this could apply to many different sites, especially sites which are physically no longer existing. And how does our idea of what Sophiatown actually was before its demolition, what it looked and felt like, because we have a very specific idea of what these places meant today, and it's been influenced by very specific factors. How does that actually change when the story gets told directly by the people there? And I think this ties in quite well with the excellent presentation by Dr. Mtala. So I don't think Sophiatown needs much of an introduction. It's space both locally and internationally, and representative of the larger story of these spaces, whether it be District 6 or Marabastad in Pretoria or spaces in Cato Manor in Durban, and really are important to our own story, spaces that need to be remembered, need to still be grappled with to a very large extent by all South Africans, and spaces that especially the youth need access to in order to deal with what this means and how it still influences the country today. And how do we do that when these sites don't physically exist in the same way anymore? So Sophiatown today is, of course, remembered generally in a very specific way. It's the jazz, it's the Miriam Makebas and the Yuma Sakelas, the big names. And Sophiatown was, of course, these things, the demolition, kind of the bullet point of what we would think Sophiatown would be. And if you ask someone from overseas what it was, these were the things they would come up with. But Sophiatown, just that. It was a place of 60,000 people who lived and built up this remarkable community, and communities like it all over South Africa that was, as Dr. Mtala said so well, more than just about the pain. And we cannot make it only about the pain, not to ignore the difficult aspects of heritage, but to place it in context of all the other achievements and just what it was like to and what it meant and the significance of that. So to that, we've been working with the Trevor Huddleston Museum, which is an NGO, but essentially Sophiatown's main museum today. And they're an interesting museum because they do a lot of community work, a lot of skills training programs. They're essentially Sophiatown's only library in many ways. And they provide this for free to the community, as well as to communities for people who were dispossessed or had to move out of Sophiatown. So people who were historically dispossessed from Sophiatown as well. And that's really interesting. But if you go on a walking tour today, which I would recommend, it's quite interesting. They take you through the suburbs of Sophiatown today, which has, of course, been completely changed. They have a flip file, and they show you photos of what used to be. They would point to a house and say, this used to be the biggest cinema in Africa. The KFC, this is where Miriam Makeba first sang. And especially when working with school groups or large groups, which is maybe their main clientele, that's very difficult. How can you actually get a visual idea of what a place was from a flip file in a group of 50 people walking through a neighborhood? So we were thinking that if we have some kind of experience like this, where you get a spatial, tangible experience of what Sophiatown might have looked like and felt like, and just people are usually quite surprised just how big it was, just how much actually was lost. That completely changes your experience doing the walking tour of what it looks like today. And that has been quite a nice confirmation of the value of this work and how it, especially since we are going to, which is important. So taking a step away from Sophiatown briefly, I want to talk about how these experiences are usually made, because cultural heritage in virtual reality is actually not a new proposition. Almost as soon as virtual reality became a thing, people started trying to represent heritage with it. Briefly, just to access information, but I think this, just the differentiation between tangible and intangible heritage is important to keep in mind. So in my silly example, the tangible heritage would be the Colosseum, the structure, the things you can touch, and intangible would, in this case, a gladiator fight, an event that happened there, the memories, the significance of the space. So just for some background on that. So there are 4 typologies of cultural heritage representations are represented in virtual reality that I've been able to find in my research. The first is to scan the site as it currently is, put that in VR. So there's a scan of the Colosseum as it is in its ruined state today. You put it in VR, anyone can visit it. And this is fine, but of course you work with the state of the site today, and if the site no longer exists, you cannot. The second type is to reconstruct what the site might have looked, usually in some idealized state, and often when it was supposed to be new. And this could work with the ruins of the site, so forth. Thirdly, we have the use of photos and film. This is especially when the site no longer exists or has been radically altered. You use what it looked like, and you reconstruct using these sources as clues. It often provides incomplete data, but it is a way to bring back some of these sites. But now again, you need a site that has been well documented to an extent. And then lastly, and this has really exploded in the last few years, especially in a place like China, which is really interesting, but there are also a lot of these experiences occurring in South Africa involved with, which is really interesting that we are actually quite on the forefront of this more than we realize. And that is the representation of intangible heritage within VR. This is an example of a sun hunting excursion project, but I know the colleague who was, and they go on this excursion and you see how they go about it, sneak on the animals, prepare the animals, all of that thing. But there are a lot of these experiences coming up, a few in South Africa and a lot in China, especially, where you would do traditional basket weaving, traditional jade carving, traditional music, that kind of thing. But now it's not site-specific necessarily. It's still a kind of devoid of site representation of intangible heritage only. And here you can see how the amount of intangible heritage experiences in VR have really kind of exploded in the last few years. And I hope my research will add in the last couple of years as soon as I've concluded that. Okay, so back to Sophiatown. If these are the 4 ways that these heritage sites are represented, how can we work with a site like Sophiatown, a site that has physically been lost? There is a church which still exists, which has been altered, and all the murals have been painted white and whitewashed. There is the Dr. Kloma House, which is the only remaining structure, part of the Trevor Huddleston Center. There is a completely destroyed original house. The roof has caved in, it's completely mothballed, and will probably be demolished one day, unfortunately. And there is a boundary wall. That is all that exists of a neighborhood that had at least 60,000 people living there at its height, and which all of South Africa, and even internationally, people are aware of, and which is an important part of our history. That is all we have to work with physically. So how can we represent this? Because the current methodologies, a site like Sophiatown, and by extension places like District 6, Cato Manor, Marabastad, wherever we have this situation, it's essentially unrepresentable using the current ways of representing sites digitally. Or at least it's very limited in how it can be represented. So can we use memory? How can we represent cultural heritage sites for which there are no or very few physical remains and insufficient photos and film? And in the case of Sophiatown, it's interesting because there are photos, there is some film, but most of it is of the demolition. And we cannot make the story of Sophiatown only about its demolition. And I think Dr. Matala said it much better than I could when he said, people are more than pain, their stories are more than just the bad things that happen to them. It's kind of like, you cannot just make it about that, right? And the important stories are the stories that happened in silence in the past, as Dr. Matala said. So if we only work with photographs which show the demolition and the desolation, that is actually doing an extreme injustice, because you're not portraying what this place was, you're simply showing that this place no longer is, which people already know, right? So can intangible heritage, and specifically memories, be used to represent physically lost tangible heritage? And Don Matera's book, and Don Matera, of course, grew up in Sophiatown, was called Memory is the Weapon. And it was a big starting point for us here, how he spoke about how memory, no matter what happens, no matter what is taken away, memory preserves itself and perpetuates places which no longer physically exist. And we were thinking, how can we actually technically do this? How can we take a memory and make it spatial? Is that actually possible to do in any rigorous way? Here are just some stills from the experience. This was made in 2021, but I'm currently updating it now. As we've conducted our interviews, we've compiled our interviews, and I'll show you how we've done that process. And it's actually been amazing, because I look at this now, which I made in 2021, and there are so many changes because of direct feedback from the former residents and directly listening to their descriptions. And I'm excited to have it ready if all goes on track next year, and it will look quite a lot different from this. But this is the experience that we have currently. So back to our question. In virtual reality, how can diverse ethnographic accounts be used as valid data? And that is very important, valid data, because we cannot create a fake or inaccurate version of Sophiatown. We cannot create a Disneyland kind of version of this, because this is real history, this is a real place, and it needs to be represented as accurately as possible. Because if it is misrepresented, that will perpetuate certain ideas and stereotypes, possibly for future generations, which would, of course, be quite a big issue. So what makes data valid? How can we work with memory, which is a very slippery and unreliable thing sometimes, and give it validity? Now, validity works in two ways. There's the reliability and the verifiability. The reliability simply refers to the distance between the observation and the recipient of the observation. So if I took a ruler and measured my desk, that is very reliable. You can ask if I did it accurately and if it were working, but it is reliable in that I measured it myself. If I ask someone else to measure my desk, that is less reliable, because I do not have full control over what's happening in that process. Following this logic, you would see that photographs and measurements. Ethnographic accounts are less reliable than photographs, and so on. And in the verifiability refers to how many people or how many sources agree on the same data point. If I had an interview with a former resident and I asked about the color of the Atlas Bakery, which is a site that everyone remembered and brought up independently, but of which one not very, it's not very verifiable. But if I ask 10 people independently and they all say it's green, you can be completely sure it was. And that gives a lot of validity to data, which otherwise would be seen as unreliable because of the distance and the inaccessibility to the data source. So using this, I set up a kind of hierarchy, which I think, which we want to motivate to be used in any representation of heritage. And you're working from left, which is the most reliable, to right, which is the least reliable. And I'll go through this now. So mostly on the left, we've got current data. We start with actual measurements, which, as implied, would be you actually measuring a site. But of course, for this, the site still needs to be physically there to work with this. Moving to mathematical measurements, which might be working with Google Earth, something like that, or using equations and calculations where you've got known heights of things to work out the sizes of other things. And then image-based modeling. Automatic image-based modeling would be LiDAR, photogrammetry, scanning things with 3D scanners or 360 cameras with your phone, that kind of thing. Again, you need a site and you can capture the site as it is right now. And then manual image-based modeling, which would be working with photographs, film, even paintings I've seen used before to recreate what the site might have looked like. And this is where the vast majority of virtual reality representations, or even just digital representations of heritage, this is where most of the data comes from. And the vast majority of these projects beyond this kind of data. And of course, it implies that there needs to be a physical site or a lot of documentation in order to create this site. Data, and I'll go through it from left to right again. We have relationships, which has actually been much more powerful than I thought it would in my own work. Essentially, if you know the size of a door frame, you can infer the size of and you can use this kind of logic in many different ways. In recreating the Odin cinema, we realized that the span of the mezzanine floor, which we could only see from a photo underneath, so we could see the bottom of it, would not be plausible using technology from that time. So we could get an engineer to show us how the columns would have actually had to be spaced, and we could infer, oh, so there must have been columns. We have a photo of one column on the outside, we can assume the column. So you can really go down a rabbit hole of figuring things out and putting this puzzle together to recreate a site of which photographic or physical evidence doesn't exist. A little bit later in the presentation. Next, and that is the main kind of type of source which I'm trying to. And in my survey of 200 academic papers, which document the making of heritage sites in VR, I found less than 5 that are actually using ethnography as a source. Very interestingly. And they provide 2 kinds of data, which I don't think you can really find anywhere else. First, you get the intangible heritage. You get the intangible side that's very specific. You get people's specific memories, and really why the space was significant in the first place, which is missing from a lot of these representations. Because if you only show the structure, that can only take you so far. There's still a reason why this was seen as a significant site in the first place, what actually happened here. And the small human scale detail, what it meant to people, that is very difficult to get any other place and really gets the message across of what the space meant and why it's significant. And it gets people thinking about that and grappling with what this all means. And it gets tangible details on very specific things. People remember specific things, banners on the wall, colors of the curtain, layout of chairs, which really makes the place feel specific and lived in, which photographs even cannot always capture. And that I found to be very fascinating as a way to get this kind of information. Next, we have iconographic narratives. This might be applicable in older sites, cannot interview people or there are no records, essentially a mural depicting an event, something along those lines. And then if you still have gaps in your representation, you look at architectural heritage. So it was built in a similar time and in a similar style, and we could use some of the elements there to fill in some way. And then finally, you have artificial data, which a shocking amount of these VR representations use. This data should not be used because it is made usually just the maker of the representations of typical biases filling in the gaps. And that is very dangerous because you're now perpetuating these biased stereotypes and ideas by making data up, essentially. So I think by following this hierarchy, we can avoid a lot of this artificial data actually coming into these representations and misrepresenting events and sites. This line will become more interesting once my study is complete, but this is essentially the line of what data is mostly used by different representations. So again, I looked at 200 of these, not quite done capturing all the data, but it's quite clear. Current data, actual measurements are a lot more popular, and theorized data a lot less, and that use artificial or made-up data where they almost don't really know how to fill in the gaps. And it is exactly this least used data that we are most interested in kind of flipping around. Oh, why is this a problem? Besides the fact that we can get more information from ethnography, why is the fact that ethnographic data isn't being used as source? What are the effects of this? And I could see two big problems with this. There is a geographic bias that emerges favoring the West, especially Europe, and for some reason, particularly Italy. Italy alone. I don't know why, but that is what it is. And then there is a bias towards what kind of heritage gets represented. A lot of these sites only show the tangible side, the structure, but not so much the heritage. What happened there, the events, the memories, the significance. Because they're not working with data that actually provides that intangible heritage. So this is not quite complete. I'd say there's about 100 projects captured here, but it's quite clear. There is a massive bias towards Europe and Italy, interestingly enough. Rome alone, 15 of these experiences were in, looks like in South America and Sub-Saharan Africa. Rome almost has more than the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa and South America has combined, which is, if you think about it. And it's not just because of funding, because we have North American or Asian universities or Australian universities doing these projects in Europe. And I think part of it is because the sites are so well preserved in Europe, so accessible, and it's quite easy to get physical data from them. You can go and you can scan them, you can measure them. Where sites in the global south, which are maybe less accessible, have been physically destroyed or erased systematically, as Dr. Matala also pointed out. That is much more difficult to get data on. So I think a lot of these projects tend to go for what's a little bit easier, even if it might not be a conscious decision. And Europe is the easiest because you can scan a site which is well kept and maintained. And then secondly, there are no cultural heritage sites that do not have intangible aspects to them. Heritage is not just the built form. It is also that, but there's a significance to that site, even if it's a significance of how people view that site today, that needs to be communicated in order to create any accurate representation of heritage. And by only looking at current data, physical data, that is completely neglected. So I'll go through the process of how I've been representing Sophiatown. We started with interviews. Very importantly, and we did it with the Trevor Huddleston Center to get interviews from former residents of Sophiatown. A good age gap, there was about a 20-year age gap between the old person we interviewed, and we made it very representative of gender, race, religion, age, all of that, to get a diverse set of memories of Sophiatown, and not just, yes, that was important to get right. From the interviews, we transcribed them, which was quite a mission. Transcribing every single thing that they said, including translations where they would speak in Afrikaans or Sesotho, Sezulu, Tsatsitaal, which they did do. And my assistant and me, we could understand all languages and speak back. So that was also important. Coding the transcriptions and then building the network. So again, how can we take descriptions of a place and turn it into a representation of what's being described? If I didn't show you this picture of where I grew up, I just told you about it, that I would recognize as my childhood house. How can you actually accurately get that process across? That was really an important question for us, and one that hasn't really been grappled with as far as I can see. So we coded every line of the interview using constructivist grounded theory, but we added a who is speaking code to every line, a where are they speaking of, and a what are they speaking of. And here's just an example. Everything transcribed, and in every single statement was given a who is speaking, what is the place that they are talking about, and what is the event that they are talking about. From that, we built a network, and the network directly became the difference for the VR experience. So you actually are following the train of thought of the former residents as you go along this VR experience. So we'll start with a place, let's say participants' home. And then they would describe an event, because event is always tied to place, I found. Events do not float around. They're usually very, very much placed and situated within a specific site. So perhaps the event would be cooking at his home. And we differentiate between static and dynamic events. Static events would be events which do not move to another place. So cooking at your home, that stays in one place. Almost always this will move in their way of speaking to a dynamic event, which is a description of an event where you move from one place to another. So if the static event is cooking a meal, the dynamic event might be taking the meal to a wedding, and that will lead you to a new place and so on. And this is how we've been able to map this out. There are some which we still needed to represent, because we also felt it was important that it not be represented as isolated from the rest of its context, but it actually very much was embedded in the greater history and story of Johannesburg, and that the ways people navigated moving in and out of Safari was very interesting in itself and part of the story. Or it might end in a kind of dead end, where there's the description of a static event, but it does not lead to a dynamic event. In that case, I would add in a general comment that one of the participants made that I think is relevant and lead that up to another event, just to make sure there are no dead ends in the VR experience. That was maybe my biggest contribution to filling the gaps. And here's just a snippet of what this network ended up looking like. So what's great about this as well is everyone in this VR experience gets a different experience. And it's important to not represent a place like Safari as a specific thing. You know, Don Matera quite famously said, no one can write the real story of Safari. And we definitely took that as a starting point for our work as well. So I might be in the VR experience on Morris Street, and I might move to the street. And I'll get an audio description of the street, which will take me to Freedom Square, and then I'll be in a new space, following the train of thought of the person who's narrating. You might be in Morris Street, and you'd see some games, some dice on a chair outside. You would go to that, you would get an audio description of that, and that'll take you to another site. So this was also a way for us to get hours and hours of interviews into a 20-minute VR experience, because we did not want to bias what we end up cutting out. The point there was also that if you remember something for 70 years, it's important. We placed playing tag on the street on the same level as a political rally, because we didn't want to make a judgment on what is actually important, because now you're curating what Safari was, and that comes from certain biases and stereotypes. And we really wanted to give as much power as possible to the former residents to just say what their Safari was and to communicate that faithfully, whatever it might have been. You know, someone just spoke about their garden for a long time. That's quite interesting. No one knows about that, and that's obviously what they remember as being important after 70 years. You want to be respectful of that, and it shows you a different side that you might not have known of about Safari. So that was important. Here's a snippet of the larger network. It became quite large, but it's been invaluable in guiding how this thing gets constructed, and then of course snippets from the experience. So I'll quickly go through how I implemented this hierarchy that's been developed to just show you the power of working through this in a systematic way. So we'll start with current data. The only thing I could really get using physical measurements was the size of the plot, because it did not change between the new construction after the demolition and the site before. This is looking at the Oden Cinema specifically, which was the biggest cinema in Africa. Next, after that's been exhausted, we look at manual images. And this is how much I could get from looking at old photographs of the Oden Cinema. And this is where most of these VR experiences kind of stop. And clearly, even though we've got something happening here, this is not adequate to fully represent what the site was. So the next thing in the hierarchy is dependency relationships, where we work out, okay, we've got the size of the door frame, what with the door frame, and so forth. And you can actually get quite a bit out of this, and you can see that this really wraps up the structure, what the structure actually was, what it looked like. And now we can start getting into the intangible side of things. Next, we look at the ethnographic data. And now I think you can see it's starting to feel like an actual place. There are specific elements, specific chairs, specific lights, specific ways that things were organized, which makes it feel like a unique place. And this is something that you can get from ethnographic data. And it actually even surprised me, to be honest. I didn't think I would get so much spatial information from it, but it really makes that difference between it being a slightly generic site to being someplace that feels specific, which is important. And then once we got to architectural heritage, there was actually very little I needed to borrow from other similar sites. Some details on the balustrade, some details on the ceiling, that was about it. So on that, I have a video of the experience, but I wonder how much time we have, and I wonder if I should just have it played while questions are being asked. Ben, do you think I should play it with the audio? How much time we have?
Please.
Or should we play it in the background?
No, you're welcome to play it with the audio, and then we'll take questions after.
Okay, just stop me if you think. It's about 10 minutes.
I think we can do about 3 to 4 minutes.
Perfect.
All right.
Okay.
Endless one, nightmarish and foreboding. I awoke in a cold sweat. The room was, and I was choking. Fresh air, God, how I need fresh air to rush into my lungs and fill them with the burst of life. I opened the squeaking door, and the crisp, sharp breath of the early morning prinkled my nostrils. I drew in great gasp of the life-giving gas.
I'm just going to jump to, because we have limited time, a few other sites.
She shrugged her shoulders helplessly. It can't be helped. If the man had to die, he had to die. All I know, when I die, I will collect a fortune in hell and pay my way to heaven with it. Sisanyana, appearing with my 6-inch Marx Cocainian, caught me studying a picture that was hanging over the fireplace. It was the picture of Jesus on the crucifix. I thought this picture was as out of place here as it would be if it was hanging in the heart of Prince Lucifer's name. He's Jesus Christ, our Savior. I pay protection money to. What kind of protection money? I asked. Lifting her lovely eyes, she said, does it matter what kind of protection as long as I am protected? Sophia Town, the city of many faces, kind, cruel, pagan, Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, and Hindu, and the face of what was called law and what was made criminal. Each face told its own story, held its own secret, and added to the book that was Kofifi, the Little Chicago of Johannesburg. Sophia Town had two Jewish-owned cinemas, the Picture Palace, also named Pulaski after its owner, and the Odeon, owned by a man called Lakeya. The Odeon was said to be the largest cinema in the whole of Africa, with a seating capacity of about 1,100. It was also used as a concert hall, a church, and a venue for mass political meetings by organizations such as the African National Congress, the Anti-Removals Committee, the Defiance of Campaign Committee, the internationally singer Miriam Makeba, who later went into exile and was prohibited from returning to South Africa, also performed where knives and guns were carried and used by members of the audience.
So I think I'll stop it there. The prototype, which was made in 2021. And what you're hearing is from a short story that we found. So this is before we did the interviews. And what has been amazing to me is if you look at the Odin here versus what it looks like now after we've done the interviews and kind of gone through the systematic process, you can see that it's a lot more detailed than what we were able to put together in 2021 with the traditional way of working with it. So I'm really excited to get the final, much more accurate version working, and hopefully we'll have that at the museum next year. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the questions now.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Again, absolutely fascinating. I can see the round of applause coming in from the audience. You and Dr. Motala have a way of just taking me back to primary school and making heritage extremely exciting. You know, the work that we're doing, as Dr. Layton said earlier, is extremely difficult because we are trying to preserve memories for people who have not been born yet. And Dr. Layton was talking about 200 years, and here we are right now conserving for future generations. These are people that are not born yet. So in terms of the work that you're doing, and again, colleagues, please write your comments in the chat. Please raise your hands if you have questions for Isaac. We have him for about 10 minutes. We'll just do a quick Q&A before we conclude. But yes, I'll get to your questions in the chat, and please raise your hands. But you know, your methodology, Isaac, is extremely complex and meticulous. And I think it has to be because with what you're doing, small decisions have big implications, especially when you are recreating something that has a very strong connotation of pain no longer available to the people who used to access it. So that's, I think, extremely important. I also really particularly value your meticulousness because Dr. Layton spoke about trust in the data that we are presenting or that we are conserving and representing. And that trust is important when you look at the mustard mill, for example, the reconstruction of the mustard mill. They were able to reconstruct it because the scans that they did were so accurate. Yes, there are no standards, but they were able to have a lot of trust in that data and therefore reproduce the mustard mill based on the data which was scanned. I'm also extremely surprised by the geographical bias, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. But even in Saharan Africa, I'm surprised that Egypt doesn't have a strong presence of VR experiences, which I thought, you know, the pyramids would be one of the first sites that anyone would want to go and reproduce. And the video representation, I think, again, extremely powerful. The narration also speaks to the work that Dr. Motala is doing in terms of having the people that experience the site narrate the story of the site and then combining that with the technological aspect. So my question, sorry, that was a mouthful of comments. Now my questions, in terms of the work that you're doing, again, similar to Dr. Motala, we have your VR experience. We have Digital Heritage Africa also doing scanning of archaeological material, sites, etc. How do we bring that all together in order to have a sustainable industry that's based around, let's say, digital cultural heritage? I just want to know your thoughts around that. Let me stop there. I've got more questions. There are people in the chat. Please go ahead and respond.
That is a very big question, and one I've certainly thought about a little bit, because there are all these grassroots kind of things happening, and how do we make it sustainable? So I think there's a few kind of practices that need to become common or maybe even legislated in some way. The first is to publish your data and to get it open to scrutiny. If I look at these digital representations, there are so many which really just make things up a little bit. Never everything, never, but there are some which really just fill in the gaps, and that gets filled in by the researcher's own bias. And these researchers are usually not from the culture or the group that they're representing. That's very dangerous and erodes trust. So there needs to be a meticulous way of recording everything. And I think following these data sources and saying, this is all the data I got from measurements, this is all the data I got from interviews, whatever it is, that needs to be open to public scrutiny somehow. So someone can come 6 months later and say, that's wrong. I was there. That's not correct. And we can adjust that. So there actually needs to be a way that these things are seen not as static, but they become kind of living representations, living repositories that people can contribute to. So if I get this at the museum and former residents visit the museum often, and I will hope and I will want to make myself available so that if they say, that is not correct, I can change that quite easily and just give the museum a new version. So I think we need to stop seeing these things as end products and start seeing them as ever-evolving processes, and somehow that needs to be supported or made possible.
Thank you so much. Isaac, let's get to the chat. There's a number of comments here. We've got Nancy saying thank you for the interesting presentation. We have Mr. Ralph Schroeder, again, thanking you for the interesting presentation. We actually have the CEO of Robben Island, who says this is good research work, well done. The whole issue of access to this type of work to our youth to share this rich history will be of great benefit. May Abby, I'd like to just bring you in to maybe elaborate a bit on your points. We've got Isaac here. Again, he's also available for us to work with in future. Would you like to come on the line, May Abby?
Thank you very much to the good presentation, not only to Mr. Potgieter, but to the other presenters. I think for me, having to look at the methodology that was followed in this research, PhD research, it also used the opportunity to close some of the missing information that is now coming forward that some of us didn't know. And I think for me, the most challenge in terms of the work that we do as heritage sites and institutions, the whole issue of how do we make this accessible to our youth? Because for me, it's one thing doing this great and excellent research, but it's another when our youth, which are the South Africans, could benefit, because the whole idea is for us to promote and preserve that research. So I wish the next step, Mr. Potgieter, is to then take it to an ordinary youth within that remote area. Someone who has never been to Marabastad, someone who has never been to Sophia Town, but at least knowing this rich history. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
This is great work.
Thank you so much, Mayor Abby. That is the CEO of Robben Island Museum. I'm just going to take another comment, then I'll bring Isaac in to just respond. There's a comment from Mawane Tulo, again, interesting presentation. Lee Omile, I see you've said, I remember seeking into a lecture by Dr. David Copland, who was lecturing on the music scene of Sophia Town. I always wondered how it might have looked and felt. Thank you for working on that representation. Leo Mile, you can come in just to elaborate a little bit more, and then we'll get a response from Isaac. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ben. I was not supposed to be in that lecture. It was an anthropology lecture, and some of my friends were talking about it, and I've heard my uncle refer to the work by Dr. David Copland. And so he had written a book, and part of his lecture series was just to take the students through that scene at the time from an anthropological perspective. And so in one of the lectures that I sat on, it was about the music scene around that time. And so it's quite interesting to then see the representation as it comes alive. Thank you.
So much. Isaac, you can respond, and then I've just got 2 more questions, and then we'll let you go again. I could speak to you and Dr. Motala for 5 hours, but I don't think people have that much time. Please go ahead.
Yes, thanks. I quickly got a notification saying I've got 5 minutes left on my Teams. I don't know why, but if I fall out, I'll jump back in as quickly as I can. You know, it's so interesting. working in VR in South Africa, because there's actually something happening where these technologies, which are very expensive, they actually have the potential to make things even more accessible. So an example, a VR headset is about 10,000 Rand. I can implement that in a museum. We can give ownership of that to the museum, which is what we will be doing, and they can take it to expos or other museums or whatever it may be, giving them income. But yes, how can we get the spread far and wide? Now, there are actually these little goggles, which are 20 Rand each, which I was in Uppington just 2 weeks ago when we were showing this work to a small school there. Not even in Uppington, it was Oscam. It was a very small town, like way in the north. And we gave them these little goggles, they're 20 Rand. Kids slide their phones in, they have the downloaded experience, and they can experience it in that way. So this is actually something that's scalable in a very big way. And these little devices, you can watch maps and physics videos and whatever it is, but now also things like this for heritage. So I'm actually continuously fascinated by how VR has the potential to make things more accessible and not less. And I think that's not such an obvious fact to first world countries implementing this, where they're getting the high-tech technology and they're implementing it, and schools are getting VR labs. We don't need VR labs. There are actually inexpensive ways that are just as effective of spreading this out. So absolutely, if there's support for this, that would be quite an amazing thing to get this one down. And the Trevor Huddleston Museum itself is really interesting because they do a lot of community training. They've got centers in Limpopo and the Eastern Cape where they regularly go and they do coding training for kids there and so on. They really are more of a community impact kind of NGO and museum. And it just makes sense and is scalable if there's funding and appetite. In terms of the second question, it's interesting that one on the Odin Cinema. No one has seen what the Odin Cinema looks in its entirety for 60 years. And I made that presentation, I made that model 3 weeks ago. The erasure of these sites was so thorough, but yet looking at people's memories and the sheer tenacity of people remembering this and deeming it as important is actually enough if we go through this whole methodology to bring these spaces, to make it visible again. And that to me is really exciting, that it's actually possible. And looking at the Odin now, which is a comprehensive, recognizable representation of a site which no one has seen for 60 plus years, that's so interesting. And yeah, I suppose it's interesting to hear that people have wondered what this place looked like. And we even had the director of the Sapphire Town play come and look. And he said to us, I have spent so much of my time working with Sapphire Town, and I was completely surprised by what it actually looks like looking at this. And that to me really confirms the value of this, because we need to know what these places looked like and what we had in order to know where we want to go.
All right, Isaac. My very last question to you before we conclude for today. If you had infinite resources and all the money in the world, what is the end state of where you'd want to see this technology go?
I was wondering if you're going to ask me this. I think there are so many heritage sites which no longer physically exist, but which are, in my opinion, much more important to deal with than a 2,000-year-old Roman temple or whatever it is people, I think working with a lot of these sites, if there's a possibility to work at District 6, other sites outside of South Africa, all over Africa, this methodology has the potential to bring to the forefront a lot of places which physically don't exist and to give it some form that people can deal with. And I would, and also to disseminate this quite widely. That would be amazing to be able to do on multiple sites. And then also to make sure that the ownership of this goes to the right place, that it's not just published on an app store and I or UJ make the profit or goes to a German museum, but that it actually goes to the custodians of this heritage so that they can use it to create some kind of sustainability for themselves and impact the community. And if I have infinite resources, I would be happy to do that. So really, I think there's a lot of potential here. And this, I hope that this is kind of a case study and a proof that this is possible, that could hopefully then be implemented at more sites.
Thank you so much, Isaac. I think I'm going to end it there. Otherwise, we're going to continue until 4 p.m. And this brings us to the end of our last presentation for today. Isaac, if you could please leave your contact information in the chat. And I made a promise earlier this year that I'm going to bring you and Dr. Mutala together. So I'm still working on that. I think it's a very important, there's so much synergy between the work that you're doing, and there will be future collaboration. There's also the contact information of the GDHA team. So anyone who wants to do work around digital cultural heritage, 3D scanning, VR tours, etc., please get in contact with our presenters from today. They are very much willing. They also do need resources, as we do all, but I think this is an area that we really have to invest in. So today, colleagues, we are at the end of our day 3 session. Please join us tomorrow for day 4, which is the launch of SARUS 2.0. I want to give a very big thank you to Dr. Layton, Dr. Mutala, and soon to be Dr. Potgieter for the fantastic work that they are doing. We talk all the time about heritage being for future generations, but as we know, they are not going to consume this heritage in the same way that we do, and that is through maybe museums or even visiting these sites. So by creating these virtual tours, by 3D scanning and creating virtual records of all of our heritage sites, we may be doing the best thing we can for these future generations. So I've been blown away by the presentations today. I really hope you were as well. And ultimately, we will continue this dialogue around digital cultural heritage. I spoke to Dr. Mutala today to say that we really need to now have a showcase of some sort next year, bringing all of the work being done by the very separate entities together into a single space where we can curate these experiences. It's still at a very early stage. We don't even have a concept yet, but if you do want to work with us, please contact Dr. Mutala, myself, or Mr. Potgieter. With that said, I want to thank you all for your very robust engagement, for joining us again for the last 3 days. Please join us tomorrow to look at SARUS 2.0, and that will bring us to the conclusion of our Heritage Month webinar for 2024. Thank you for being an amazing audience, and thank you to our wonderful speakers. The session for today is now concluded.